average interval between lives of about 700 years, their condition at the present time is practically the same. I cannot emphasize too strongly that this difference of interval must not in the least be supposed to indicate that those who came in later generate less of spiritual force during their earth lives. If there be any difference, it appears to be in favor of the men of shorter interval, for they, being as a rule more devotional, seem to be able to generate even more force in a given space of time than the others. Perhaps it would express the fact still better to say that they produce in a way a different kind of force. Probably both are necessary, each as a complement to the other. The difference of interval between lives means merely that they take their bliss in a much more concentrated form, and therefore work out the result of an equal expenditure of force in much less time. Indeed, it appears very much as though the period of their respective entries upon terrestrial life had been arranged especially in order that, after running through about the same number of incarnations, they might arrive at the same point and be able to work together. Later investigations have convinced us that there is far greater flexibility with regard to these intervals between lives than we at first supposed. It is quite true that the amount of force which a man has to work out, first in the astral plane and then in the heaven world, is precisely what he has developed during his earthly life, plus of course such further force of the same kind as he may generate during his astral or heaven lives respectively. But it is evident that the rate at which this amount of force exhausts itself is by no means always the same. The necessity of bringing groups of people into incarnation together, in order not only that they may work out mutual karmic interrelations, but also that they may all learn to labor together towards one great end, is evidently a dominant factor in regulating the rate of the expenditure of force. A study of the lives of Alcyone will show that this must be so, since it is unquestionable that a number of people, living each his or her own life, must inevitably generate widely varying amounts of spiritual force. Yet in life after life of that entrancing story it is contrived that these people shall come back together, in order that they may pass through similar preparatory experiences, and that the bonds of affection between them may be knit so strongly that they will be incapable of misunderstanding or mistrusting one another, when the strain of the real work comes upon them in the future. Besides the differences in the mode of individualization which I have just mentioned, there are also differences in the degree of individualization, which corresponds to the stage of development at which it takes place. It has been explained in theosophical literature that as an animal group soul gradually evolves within its own kingdom it breaks up into smaller and smaller subdivisions. Quadrillions of flies or mosquitoes are attached to one group soul, millions of rats or mice, hundreds of thousands of rabbits or sparrows. But when we come to such animals as the lion, the tiger, the leopard, the deer, the wolf or the wild boar, only a few thousand will be found to belong to one soul, while among domesticated animals such as sheep and oxen the number is smaller still. Individualization is possible only from 7 kinds of animals, one for each of the 7 great lines or types. Of these we already know certainly the elephant, the monkey, the dog and the cat, and the horse is possibly a 5th. Up to each of these heads of types leads a long line of wild animals, which has not yet been fully investigated. But we know that wolves, foxes, jackals and all such creatures culminate in the dog, and lions, tigers, leopards, jaguars and ocelots in the domestic cat. When we reach these 7 individualizable animals we find usually only a few hundred attached to each group soul, and as their development continues the souls break up rapidly. The pariah dog of India or Constantinople is nothing but a half-tamed wolf, and 1,000 of such creatures may well represent only one soul. But in the case of the really intelligent pet dog or cat one soul hovers over not more than 10 or a dozen bodies. Now it makes much difference at what stage of this higher animal life individualization takes place, and this is dependent largely upon the opportunities which offer themselves. Even a pariah dog is presumably capable of individualization, but it could be only a very low type of individualization. The animals of the moon chain were not the same as those of today, and so we cannot draw exact parallels. But assuredly the pariah dog could at most individualize into nothing more than a separated fragment of the group soul with a monad hovering over it, connected perhaps by a line or two of spiritual matter, corresponding therefore to the animal men from the moon, who led the way in filling the forms in the first round. On the other hand, the really intelligent and affectionate pet dog or cat, whose owner looks after him properly and makes a friend of him, would certainly, when he individualized, obtain a causal body at least equivalent to that of the first order of moon men, while various intermediate types of domestic animals would produce the basketwork causal body, such as that obtained by the second order of the moon men. It will be seen therefore that the amount of real work done in the attainment of any given level is practically always the same, though in some cases more of it is done in one kingdom and less in another. It has already been made abundantly clear, in the course of our investigations, that entities attaining to the culminating point in one kingdom do not enter the lower levels of the next higher kingdom. The life which ensouls an oak tree, a banyan, or a rose bush will pass directly into the mammalian order when it enters the animal kingdom. Whereas the life which leaves the vegetable kingdom at a much lower level may pass into the stage of insects and reptiles. In just the same way, a being who reaches the summit of intelligence and affection possible in the animal kingdom will overleap the absolutely primitive conditions of humanity, and will show himself as a first-class individuality from the beginning of his human career. Whereas one who leaves the animal kingdom at a lower level will quite naturally have to begin correspondingly lower down in the scale of humanity. This is the explanation of a remark once made by one of our masters, when referring to the cruelty and superstition shown by the great mass of humanity: they have individualized too soon, they are not yet worthy of the human form. The three methods of individualization which I have already mentioned, through the development of affection, intellect, and will, are the normal lines which we may suppose to have been intended in the scheme of things. Individuality is, however, occasionally attained in certain other ways which we may perhaps define as irregular methods, since it would seem that they can scarcely have been part of the original plan. For example, at the beginning of the seventh round of the moon chain a certain group of beings were at the point of individualization, and were drawn towards it by their association with some of the perfected inhabitants whom we call the Lords of the Moon. An unfortunate twist, however, entered into their development, and they began to take so great a pride in their intellectual advance, that became the prominent feature in their character. So that they were working not to gain the approval or affection of their masters, but to show their advantage over their fellow animals, and to excite their envy. It was this latter motive which pushed them on to make the efforts which resulted in individualization, and so the causal bodies which were formed showed almost no color but orange. The authorities in charge of that stage of evolution nevertheless allowed them to individualize, apparently because if they had been permitted to continue their evolution in the animal kingdom any further, they would have become worse instead of better. We have therefore the extraordinary spectacle of a detachment of egos, what we have lately been calling a shipload, numbering about 2 millions, who had individualized themselves entirely by pride, and who, though clever enough in their way, possessed but little of any other quality. The fruitage of the first, second and third globes of the seventh round of the lunar chain was intended to play a certain part in the development of humanity on the earth. At a certain stage in the development of that planet we know that 7 of the Lords of the Moon, one belonging to each great type, descended to the earth and began to cast off etheric bodies for the shaping of the new race. The entities who occupied these vehicles intermarried, and when their descendants became numerous these 3 shiploads of egos were called upon to descend and occupy these vehicles, and thus establish the type of the humanity that was to come. 1/3 refuses, 2/3 obey. It was the members of this orange-colored shipload from planet A of the lunar chain who declined these lowly vehicles, while the golden-colored egos from globe B and the rose-colored group from globe C accepted the conditions, entered into the vehicles, and fulfilled their destiny. The future career of these orange-colored egos showed clearly enough the undesirability of the line along which they had come. For not only did they refuse to take the primitive bodies which were assigned to them, thus leaving them to be occupied by very much lower animal types, and so leading to the sin of the mindless, but all through their history their arrogance and unruliness caused constant trouble to themselves and to others who were infected by their foolishness. Eventually the law of evolution forced them to occupy bodies in many respects considerably worse than those which had at first been offered to them. And though that lesson taught them something, and they seem to have recognized that a mistake had been made, even when they mingled with ordinary humanity we find them invariably in opposition. And perpetually making trouble by standing upon their own dignity at inopportune moments. By constant collision with natural laws the great majority of them have by degrees been driven more or less into line with the rest of humanity. But even now we may distinguish some of them by the occasional recrudescence of their old objectionable characteristics. They are still turbulent and aggressive, independent and separative, prone to discontent and eager for change, as our president has described them. Some few of the cleverest of them have made no inconsiderable mark upon human history, for they developed into the celebrated Lords of the Dark Face of Atlantis, of whom we read so much in the Secret Doctrine. And later such special distortions became world-devastating conquerors, caring nothing for the thousands who were slain or starved in the course of the gratification of their mad ambition, or, later still, equally unscrupulous American millionaires. Well called by their parasites Napoleons of finance. Another abnormal method in which individuality has been gained is through fear. In the case of animals who have been cruelly treated by man, there have been cases in which the cunning developed by strenuous efforts to understand and avoid the cruelty has caused the breaking away from the group soul. And produced an ego possessing only a very low type of intellectuality, an ego who, when he puts himself down into the lower planes, must inevitably, because of the nature of his permanent atoms, draw around him mental and astral vehicles capable only of expressing the less desirable passions. A variant of this case is the type of ego in which the attitude caused by the cruelty has been rather that of intense hatred than of fear. That force also is strong enough to develop such intelligence as may be necessary to injure the oppressor, and in that way also individuality has been secured. It is not difficult to imagine the kind of human being that would be produced along such lines as these, and this is the explanation of the existence of the fiendishly cruel and bloodthirsty savages of whom we sometimes hear. Of the inquisitors of the Middle Ages, and of those who torture children in the present day. Of them it is distinctly true that they have come into humanity far too soon, and are displaying under its guise an exaggerated form of some of the very worst characteristics of the most unpleasant types of animals. Yet another variant is the entity who is individualized by an intense desire for power over others, such as is sometimes shown by the chief bull of a herd. An ego developed in such a way often manifests great cruelty, and appears to take pleasure in it, probably because to torture others is a manifestation of his power over them. On the other hand, those who have been individualized at a comparatively low level along one of the regular lines, as by affection, provide us with a type of equally primitive but joyous and good-natured savages, in fact, who are not savage but kindly, as are many of the tribes to be found in some of the islands of the southern seas. As we look at these early stages of our development upon the moon chain, it often seems as though the mode of individualization of an ego depended upon mere chance, upon the accident of environment. Yet I do not believe that this is so. Even for animals the environment is not accidental, and there is no room for chance in a perfectly ordered universe. I should not be surprised if further investigation should reveal to us that the very mode of the individualization was somehow predetermined either for or by the monad himself, with a view to preparation for whatever portion of the great work he is to undertake in the future. There will come a time when we shall be part of the great heavenly man, not in the least as a myth or a poetic symbol, but as a vivid and actual fact, which we ourselves have seen. That celestial body has many members. Each of these members has its own function to fulfill, and the living cells which are to form part of them need widely different experiences to prepare them. It may well be that from the dawn of evolution the parts have been chosen, that each monad has his destined line of evolution, and that his freedom of action is concerned chiefly with the rate at which he shall move along that line. In any case our duty is clear, to push ahead as rapidly as we can, watching ever to discern the divine purpose, living only to fulfill it, striving always to help onwards the great scheme of the Logos by helping our fellow man. The 7 types. The 7 great types or rays do not correspond to the planes, for each type is to be found upon all the planes. One may symbolize the planes as horizontal, as they are usually represented in theosophical diagrams. And then if we proceed to draw 7 vertical columns cutting across the 7 planes at right angles, those columns will symbolize the types. This will cut up our diagram into 49 square, and in reality each of these 49 has also 49 subdivisions in the same manner, because each plane has 7 subplanes, and each type has 7 subtypes, which are produced by the influence upon it of each of the other types in turn. A diagram which clearly explains this may be found in The Secret Doctrine, Volume 3, page 483. There are 7 great types of men, coming out from the 7 great planetary logoi. Each of us belongs to one of these, but each has also a subray from one of the other types. If a man belongs to the blue or devotional type, and has the wisdom ray as his subtype, he will be wise in his devotion. But if his subray be also devotional, he may be blindly devoted having no discrimination, and therefore unable to see any blemish in the object of his worship. Yet though each of us, as has been said, has come out through one or other of the 7 planetary logoi, it does not at all follow that he will return through the same logos. Each of the great root races will produce as its flower and result what is called in the sacred books a heavenly man. One mighty being who actually includes within himself all those members of the root race who have made themselves worthy of such inclusion, includes them precisely as our physical body includes millions of cells. True, we have all of us incarnated in other root races, but we belong to that root race in which we finally succeed in attaining adeptship, and it will be of the heavenly man which represents that race that we shall form a part. For each root race there is a Manu and a Bodhisattva, and these are respectively the brain and the heart of the heavenly man of the root race. We who work in the Theosophical Society are most of us following along one or other of these 2 lines, and so we shall find ourselves grouped round one or other of those centers in that glorious future. But in the heavenly man, as in the man on earth, there are 7 centers, and each of these centers is represented by an official of the occult hierarchy. Some men will be drawn to one of these centers, and some to another, so that there is the fullest possibility of development for all possible types and dispositions. These heaven-born men so formed are the true inhabitants of the solar system, the mind-born sons of the planetary logoi, destined themselves to be the planetary logoi of the future, and of them we shall be living, conscious component parts. And yet at the same time each of us will have the fullest liberty and the highest possible activity. Incomprehensible, of course, to our present power of thought, but utterly true, nevertheless. Well for us if we can attain our level and take our part along with the great masters who are the leaders of our society. If that be too high for us at present, there will be other opportunities in the future, others, and yet others, stretching away in endless vistas. Yet those of us who are earnest students in this society have now a glorious opportunity, of which we should do well to take the fullest advantage, for if we lose it who knows how many lives of hard work it will take us to earn such another. Soon the teacher of angels and men will show himself upon earth once more. Happy are we in that we are allowed to help, even though it be ever so little, to prepare the way for his coming. Happier yet will be those of us who shall see him face to face, who will be privileged to work under him in the service of humanity when that day of the Lord shall dawn. Stray notes on races. The Irish race. The Irish are not of Atlantean stock, but belong to the 4th subrace of the 5th root race. It is true that Ireland was part of the Atlantean continent, and that the earliest inhabitants were of the Romohal, the 1st subrace of the 4th root race. But no recognizable trace now remains of these aborigines, who were a small dark people somewhat of the type of the Laplanders of the present day. Nor is there much now left to bear witness to the first invasion from Africa of a host led by an Ethiopian queen. But there are still some tokens of the next arrivals, a race called the Furbolgs, big, hairy-faced men who appear to have come down from Iceland, probably people of the same stock as the Ainus of Japan. The great majority of the Irish nation, not counting the Scottish immigrants of Ulster, is composed of the descendants of 2 races, the Tuatha De Danann and the Milesian. The Tuatha De Danann were men of the Caucasian stock, practically identical with the early Greeks, and they reached Ireland by a circuitous northern route, having moved up gradually through Russia, and round by Sweden and Norway. In the manner of the curious slow, wholesale migrations of those earlier days. They were a handsome race with oval faces, clear complexion, mostly dark hair, and deep blue or almost violet eyes. Sometimes the hair was lighter and the eyes were gray, but the other type was the more common, and one may often see it exactly reproduced among the Irish peasants of today. The Tuatha De Danann were not only so much handsomer, but also intellectually and spiritually so very much in advance of the mixed race which they found in Ireland that they were regarded by the latter as of celestial lineage. And to this day tradition speaks of them as a race of gods who ruled Ireland during a golden age, which is by no means so entirely legendary as historians generally suppose. Ireland was unquestionably the seat of a high civilization and a centre of philosophy and learning, while the neighbouring island of England was largely covered by dense forests and peopled by naked savages who painted themselves blue. The Tuatha De Danann reigned in Ireland through many ages of power and great glory, but their civilization waned in time, as all others do. And at last they were overcome by an invasion of the Milesians from Spain, a race far inferior to them in culture, spirituality, and general development, but having the rude physical strength of youth and much knowledge of the lower magic. These were a bullet-headed people, rugged and often positively ugly of face, with light or vividly red hair, a type which may also still be seen sometimes among the peasantry of the southern part of the country almost in its original purity. Far inferior as they were to the Tuatha De Danann, the Milesians were still a variant of that same fourth subrace of the Aryans. And since these two types are its main constituents, it is to that subrace that we must assign the Irish of the present day, Celts, near of kin to the Highlander of Scotland, the Welshman, the Cornishman or the Breton. At present there is unfortunately a widespread poverty and general lack of prosperity among the Irish nation in its native Erin, a condition of affairs which the Irish usually attribute to oppression by the conquering English. This oppression, so far as it is a fact, and not a figment of the imagination, comes from the radical difference between the two races, which causes a curiously complete lack of mutual understanding. The stolid matter-of-fact Anglo-Saxon cannot possibly comprehend the point of view of the imaginative and poetical Irishman, and the motives of the latter are always a sealed book to the former. The average English peasant lives almost entirely upon the physical plane, and his thought runs naturally along lines connected with his everyday interests and experiences. The average Irish peasant of the south and west lives very much upon the astral plane, and cares comparatively little about physical conditions so long as he has the accustomed astral atmosphere about him. His thoughts are usually far away from the mechanical daily round, and occupied with legends of the past, or with the stories of saints and angels and fairies. I well remember the plaintive amazement of an English landlord who, shocked at the condition of some of the cabins on his estate, had built for his labourers neat little staring brick cottages with all the latest improvements. With great difficulty he persuaded some of the peasants to try the new dwellings upon which they looked with such strong disfavour, but after a day or two every one of them went back again to the old cabins with their mud floors and leaking roofs, vowing that there was no home like the old home, with all its inconveniences. The truth was that they thought so little of the physical that these inconveniences were hardly felt at all, and weighed as nothing in the balance against the comfortable home-like feeling of the astral radiations of the old walls, to which they had been accustomed from childhood. But the Englishman knew nothing about astral vibrations, and could only marvel at the stupidity and obstinacy of people who actually preferred a miserable and unquestionably filthy old hovel to a new and clean cottage. The drunkenness which is so sadly common among the peasantry is largely referable to the same cause. It is not physical but astral sensation which is sought, and to some extent obtained, by means of the absorption of alcohol. The average Irish peasant may perhaps drink more than his English compeer, but his thoughts are on the whole far purer and more elevated. To him all women are sacred for the sake of the Virgin Mother to whom he prays, and statistics show that crimes against the weaker sex are far rarer in Erin than in Albion. The Englishman endeavours to be accurate. The Irishman cares little for accuracy, but prefers to say rather what is most courteous, or what he thinks will please. In a word, they represent two different subraces. Their development runs along quite different lines, and only the wisest and most liberal of each can possibly understand and make allowance for the peculiarities of the other. It is probable that many causes combined to produce the poverty and general lack of prosperity of the Irish. Without raising any of the vexed questions about which party opinions clash, the occultist may examine with interest at least one cause which is never suspected by those who discuss the subject in this prosaic 20th century. And that is the working of a curse pronounced against the race, or perhaps one should rather say a spell laid upon it, no less than 2,000 years ago at the time of the Milesian conquest. Students of early Irish history will remember how persistently it is stated that the invading Milesians were able to hold in thrall the distinctly superior race which they had overcome, because they cast upon it the glamour of a great illusion. This legend has a basis of fact. The priests of the Milesian religion were well acquainted with certain types of magic, and as the country was conquered they occupied it with strongly magnetized centers. They established one of these every few miles, until they had a network of them covering the whole southern and western part of the land, and even now, after the lapse of 2,000 years, a strong influence radiates from them. Great crowds of nature spirits of a certain type are still irresistibly attracted to these centers, gamble round them and are permeated by their influence, and unconsciously become its ministers, and spread it all over the country wherever they go. The spell which the Milesian priests laid upon the people was twofold, the curses of disunion and lethargy, that they should never be able effectively to combine together, but always quarrel among themselves. And that they should apathetically submit to the domination of whoever wielded or inherited the magnetic power. If any English ruler had ever known enough of magic to understand and utilize this heritage of the Milesian priests, the history of Ireland might have been different. As the Anglo-Saxon is usually blankly ignorant and blatantly incredulous with regard to all that side of nature, a very curious thing has happened. Consciously or unconsciously the Roman Church has come into that heritage, and profits by what still remains of the power of that ancient spell. And her rule is unquestioned through all the districts where long ago those priests of an older faith established their magnetic centers. The Spanish race. The whole question of racial karma is a difficult one, and I do not think that we have as yet sufficient information at our command to enable us to speak definitely upon the subject. This much is certain, that whenever we find markedly unusual conditions surrounding a race, we may conclude that the Manu in charge of that portion of evolution has in hand a number of egos who need just those conditions for their progress. The law of cause and effect must obviously govern national as well as individual affairs. Though its action is complicated by the fact that the egos who form the race when the effect arrives are usually not those who were there when the cause was set in motion. For example, it may be not unreasonable to suppose that the fact that Spain has somewhat ignominiously lost the whole of South America and Mexico has a definite karmic relation to the awful cruelty and rapacity shown in her conquest of those countries. Yet we imagine that the Spaniards who suffered loss when those countries freed themselves can hardly in all cases have been reincarnations of those who wrought such appalling havoc under Cortés and Pizarro. On the other hand, it is very probable that some of them may have been, for we know that people of the lower classes return very much sooner than those of the first class, and usually have to incarnate several times in the same branch race before they have learnt all its lessons. The Jewish race. The peculiar conditions of the Jewish race exist primarily because at this particular stage the Manu needs them for the proper training of some of the egos under his care. We can only guess at the racial karma which made those conditions possible. Perhaps the explanation is to be found in the fact that the Jewish race is descended from those Atlantean Semites who were drawn away into Arabia, apart from their fellows, by the Manu of the fifth root race when he was making his first segregation. That first attempt was not wholly successful, and a second segregation took place into the Gobi district, from which in due time was produced the first subrace of the new root race. When a second subrace was needed, the Manu sent emissaries to the descendant of those who had been left behind in Arabia, hoping to mingle with theirs the blood of the new root race. But they were so strongly impressed with the idea, which he himself had originally implanted in them, that they were a chosen race, set apart from the world and forbidden to intermarry with others. That in the name of his own teaching they now rejected his overtures, and he had to seek elsewhere for what he wanted. The particular subrace from which the Jewish nation is directly descended had moved across from Arabia to the Somali coast, in order to avoid conquest by those who followed the new teaching of the Manu. They then split off even from that dissenting band, and made their way along the shores of the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, until they entered upon the territory of Egypt. The Pharaoh of the time received them hospitably, and assigned them a tract of land on which to dwell, and they settled down there for some centuries. But as a later pharaoh sought to levy from them some impost to which they objected, and also to force them to perform for him certain unpaid labor, as his other subjects did, they protested against his claims, and continued their migration by crossing the Sinaitic desert and settling themselves in southern Syria, dispossessing, after much fighting, other robber tribes of much the same blood as themselves. The karma of that rejection has left them ever since a race apart, the same egos to a large extent incarnating again and again in that line instead of passing from race to race in the usual way. Whether some blind perception of this difference may help to account for the treatment they have received at the hands of other races I cannot definitely say. But it may also be partially due to the fact that because of the tradition of that original selection by the Manu they have always had a feeling somewhat similar to that of the Brahmins, that they are superior to all the rest of the world. And the rest of the world has not always appreciated the attitude which they adopted in consequence of that belief. They were originally a nomad tribe like the Bedouin Arabs, and lived largely by robbery, their deity being confessedly but a private tribal god who fought against the gods of other nations and was perpetually vaunting himself as superior to them. Although it will be remembered that in one case he was not able to overcome certain other races, because they had chariots of iron, Judges, I, 19. Just like all other elemental tribal deities, he required constant sacrifices of blood, and in order that he might receive plenty of these he was always exceedingly jealous lest any of his followers should desert him and make their offerings to other deities. The requiring of blood sacrifices is an invariable criterion as to the status of a deity. No entity in the least deserving of respect or worship ever made such an abominable demand. It will be found that he often suggested mean and dishonorable plans, which is quite a common thing for a tribal deity to do, but would of course be utterly impossible for any higher entity. The carrying away into captivity in Babylon of a number of these turbulent people was quite the best thing that could happen to them. They then for the first time came into contact with a highly civilized race, and for the first time heard of a supreme God of whom everything was part. Then they characteristically tried to identify their own tribal deity with this supreme being, and so caused much confusion. When they returned from this captivity they rewrote their scriptures from the memory of the older men, and then they put into them a certain admixture of the higher ideas about a supreme deity. The founder of Christianity took possession of a Jewish body. All the earlier teachers of the religion were of the same race, and so, unfortunately, they brought over into Christianity this mixed conception of a God who is full of irreconcilable characteristics, being at the same time jealous, cruel and revengeful, and yet omniscient, omnipresent and compassionate. Even at the present day the Christian Church still reads in its highest service the ridiculous old Jewish commandments, with which is incorporated the statement of the jealousy of the deity. While in another part of the very same service she acclaims him as God of God, Light of Light, Very God of Very God. If the Christians could only have left these primitive Jewish conceptions alone, and taken with reference to God the teachings of their founder, who spoke of him always as the Father in heaven, many of the troubles of the Church would have been avoided. The Atlanteans. The Atlanteans had as a race no sense of the abstract, and were unable to generalize. For example, they had no multiplication table. Arithmetic was to them a system of magic, and a child had to learn elaborate rules without ever knowing the reason for them. For example, he was taught that if 8 came beneath 8 in the particular form of magic which we now call addition, the figure 6 must be noted as the result, and the next figure to the left-hand side in the result must be increased by 1. If however the particular magic happened to be subtraction, a cipher was the result. If it was division the figure 1 appeared, if it was multiplication the figure 4 was the result, and the next figure to the left must be altered by 6. But he never knew that 8 plus 8 equals 16, or that 8 times 8 equals 64. A similar elaborate set of rules had to be memorized for every conceivable position of all the figures up to 10. These 4 sets or types of mathematical magic had to be learnt just as though they were 4 conjugations of a verb. Most of their calculations, however, were made by means of machinery, a kind of abacus or framework something like that now used by the Chinese and Japanese, by means of which it is even now possible to make quite elaborate calculations, as, for example, to take the square root of any number. The Atlanteans were clever at amassing facts, and had prodigious memories. Also they invented a good deal of quite complicated machinery, though most of it would seem to us now quite clumsy in its action. We see another curious trace of their limitations in the religion which the Egyptians inherited from them. They had observed and noted most of the types of elemental essence and nature spirits, and they had named them all, and invented special forms of spells for each, by which it could be controlled. And they went on elaborately learning all these, with the feeling that if any but the right spell was applied to a particular elemental, he would probably prove destructive. Yet they never realized that the force behind the spells was in every case the human will, and that a determined exertion of that, without any spell at all, would have been equally effective in all these different places. The Book of the Dead contains great numbers of these, and only that portion of it which it was thought would be needed by each dead person was placed along with him in his tomb. The Turanian subrace of the Atlanteans made a series of experiments in what is now called democracy, and carried it to even wilder lengths than its most rabid exponents at the present day have yet suggested. The results were so utterly intolerable that the whole race broke up into anarchy and chaos, and China even now bears the impress of the violent reaction in the direction of aristocratic government which followed. The Turanians had their animal passions very strongly developed, and were in many ways not what we should call pleasant people. Mars and its inhabitants. The present condition of the planet Mars is by no means unpleasant. It is a smaller planet than the Earth and more advanced in age. I do not mean that it is actually older in years, for the whole chain of worlds came into existence, not simultaneously indeed, but within a certain definite area of time. But being smaller it lives its life as a planet more quickly. It cooled more rapidly from the nebulous condition, and it has passed through its other stages with corresponding celerity. When humanity occupied it in the 3rd round it was in much the same condition as is the Earth at the present time, that is to say, there was much more water than land on its surface. Now it has passed into comparative old age, and the water surface is far less than that of land. Large areas of it are at present desert, covered with a bright orange sand which gives the planet the peculiar hue by which we so readily recognize it. Like that of many of our own deserts, the soil is probably fertile enough if the great irrigation system were extended to it, as it no doubt would have been if humanity had remained upon it until now. The present population, consisting practically of members of the inner round, is but a small one, and they find plenty of room for themselves to live without great effort, in the equatorial lands, where the temperature is highest and there is no difficulty as to water. The great system of canals which has been observed by terrestrial astronomers was constructed by the second order of moon men when they last occupied the planet. And its general scheme is to take advantage of the annual melting of enormous masses of ice at the outer fringe of the polar snowcaps. It has been observed that some of the canals are double, but the double line is only occasionally apparent, that is due to the forethought of the Martian engineers. The country is on the whole level, and they had great dread of inundations. And wherever they thought that there was reason to fear too great an outrush of water under exceptional circumstances, the second parallel canal was constructed to receive any possible overflow and carry it away safely. The actual canals themselves are not visible to terrestrial telescopes. What is seen is the belt of verdure which appears in a tract of country on each side of the canal only at the time when the water pours in. Just as Egypt exists only because of the Nile, so do large districts on Mars exist only because of these canals. From each side of them radiate at intervals waterways, which run some miles into the surrounding country and are then subdivided into thousands of tiny streamlets, so that a strip of country 100 miles in width is thoroughly irrigated. In this area are forests and cultivated fields, and vegetation of all sorts starts forth in the greatest profusion. making upon the surface of the planet a dark belt which is visible to us even 40 million miles away when the planet is at its nearest and favorably situated. Mars is much farther from the center of the system than we are, and consequently the Sun appears to its inhabitants scarcely more than half the size that it does to us. Nevertheless, the climate of the inhabited portions of the planet is very good, the temperature during the day at the equator being usually about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, though there are not many nights in the year when there is not a touch of frost. Clouds are almost unknown, the sky being for most of the year entirely clear. The country is therefore to a large extent free from the unpleasantness of rain or snow. The Martian day is a few minutes longer than our own and their year is nearly twice as long as ours, and the variation of the seasons in the inhabited part is but slight. In physical appearance the Martians are not unlike ourselves, except that they are considerably smaller. The tallest men are not above 5 feet in height and the majority are 2 or 3 inches shorter. According to our ideas they are somewhat broad in proportion, having very great chest capacity, a fact which may possibly be due to the rarity of the air and the consequent necessity of deep breathing in order fully to oxygenate the blood. The whole civilized population of Mars is one race, and there is practically no difference in features or complexion, except that, just as among ourselves, there are blondes and brunettes. Some of the people having a faintly yellowish skin and black hair, while the majority have yellow hair and blue or violet eyes, somewhat Norwegian in appearance. They dress mostly in brilliant colors, and both sexes wear an almost shapeless garment of some very soft material which falls straight from the shoulders down to the feet. Generally the feet are bare, though they sometimes use a sort of metal sandal or slipper, with a thong round the ankle. They are very fond of flowers, of which there is a great variety, and their towns are built on the general plan of the garden city, the house usually being one-storied only, but built round inner courtyards and straggling over a great deal of ground. These houses look exteriorly as though built of colored glass, and indeed the material which is used is transparent, but it is somehow so fluted that while the persons inside enjoy an almost unimpeded view of their gardens, no one from outside can see what is going on in the house. The houses are not built up in blocks, but the material is melted and poured into molds. If a house is to be built, a sort of double mold of it is first made in metal faced with cement, and then the curious glass-like substance is melted and poured into this mold, and when it is cold and hardened the molds are taken away, and the house is finished except for a certain amount of polishing of the surface. The doors are not exactly like ours, since they have no hinges or bolts, and are opened and shut by treading on certain spots in the ground, either without or within. They do not swing on hinges, but run back into the wall on each side. All these doors and all furniture and fittings are of metal. Wood seems to be used scarcely at all. There is only one language in use over the whole planet, except for the few savage tribes, and this language, like everything in their world, has not grown up as ours have done, but has been constructed in order to save time and trouble. It has been simplified to the last possible extent, and it has no irregularities of ant sort. They have 2 methods of recording their thoughts. One is to speak into a small box with a mouthpiece on one side of it, something like that of a telephone. Each word so spoken is by the mechanism expressed as a kind of complicated sign upon a little plate of metal, and when the message has been spoken the plate falls out and is found to be marked in crimson characters, which can easily be read by those who are familiar with the scheme. The other plan is actually to write by hand, but that is an enormously more difficult acquirement, for the script is a very complicated kind of shorthand which can be written as rapidly as one can speak. It is in this latter script that all their books are printed, and these latter are usually in the shape of rolls made of very thin flexible metal. The engraving of them is exceedingly minute, and it is customary to read it through a magnifier, which is fixed conveniently upon a stand. In the stand there is machinery which unrolls the scroll before the magnifier at any desired rate, so that one reads without needing to touch the book at all. On every hand one sees signs of a very old civilization, for the inhabitants have preserved the tradition of all that was known when the great life wave of humanity occupied the planet, and have since added to it many other discoveries. Electricity seems to be practically the sole motive power, and all sorts of labor-saving machines are universally employed. The people are on the whole distinctly indolent, especially after they have passed their first youth. But the comparatively small size of the population enables them to live very easily. They have trained various kinds of domestic animals to a far higher condition of intelligent cooperation than has yet been achieved upon earth. So that a great deal of servants' and gardeners' work is done by these creatures with comparatively little direction. One autocratic ruler governs the whole planet, but the monarchy is not hereditary. Polygamy is practiced, but it is the custom to hand over all children to the state at a very early age to be reared and educated, so that among the vast majority of the people there is no family tradition whatever. And no one knows who are his father and mother. There is no law compelling this, but it is considered so decidedly the right thing to do and the best for the children that the few families who choose to live somewhat more as we do, and to educate their children at home, are always regarded as selfishly injuring their prospects for the sake of what is considered mere animal affection. The state is thus in the position of universal guardian and schoolmaster, and the school authorities of each district are instructed carefully to sort the children according to the aptitudes which they display. And their line of life is decided for them in this manner, a very wide range of choice, however, being allowed the individual child as he approaches years of discretion. But children who show at the same time great intellect and wide general capacity are set apart from all the rest, and trained with a view of becoming members of the ruling class. The king has under him what may be called viceroys of large districts, and they in turn have under them governors of smaller districts, and so on down to what would be equivalent here to the headman of a village. All these officials are chosen by the king from this group of specially educated children, and when the time of his own death is considered to be approaching, it is from the already appointed officials that he chooses his successor. They have brought their scientific medical studies to such perfection that disease has been eliminated, and even the ordinary signs of the approach of old age have been to a large extent got rid of. Practically no one appears old, and it would seem that they hardly feel old, but, after a life somewhat longer than our own, the desire to live gradually fades away, and the man dies. It is quite customary for a man who is losing interest and feels that death is approaching, this corresponds to what we should call a centenarian, to apply to a certain scientific department which corresponds to what we might call a school of surgery, and ask to be put painlessly to death, a request which is always granted. All these rulers are autocratic, each within his own sphere, but appeal to a higher official is always possible, though the right is not frequently exercised. Because the people usually prefer to acquiesce in any fairly reasonable decision rather than to take the trouble involved in an appeal. The rulers on the whole seem to perform their duties fairly well. But again one gets the impression that they do so not so much from any preeminent sense of right or justice as to avoid the trouble that would certainly ensue from a flagrantly unjust decision. One of the most remarkable things about this people is that they have absolutely no religion. There are no churches, no temples, no places of worship of any sort whatever, no priest, no ecclesiastical power. The accepted belief of the people is what we should call scientific materialism. Nothing is true but what can be scientifically demonstrated, and to believe anything which cannot be so demonstrated is regarded as not only the height of folly, but even as a positive crime, because it is considered a danger to the public peace. Martian history in the remote past was not unlike our own, and there are stories of religious persecutions, and of peoples whose beliefs were of so uncomfortable a nature that they forced them not only into feverish energy for themselves, but also into perpetual interference with the liberty of thought of other people. Martian public opinion is quite determined that there shall never again be any opportunity for the introduction of disturbing factors of that sort, and that physical science and the lower reason shall reign supreme. And though there, as here, events have occurred which material science cannot explain, people find it best to say nothing about them. Nevertheless, on Mars, as in other places, there are a certain number of people who know better than this, and many centuries ago a few of these joined themselves together into a secret brotherhood to meet and discuss such matters. Very gradually and with infinite precaution, they took other recruits into this charmed circle, and so came into existence, in this most materialistic of worlds. A secret society which not only believed in superphysical worlds but practically of their existence, for its members took up the direct study of mesmerism and spiritualism, and many of them developed a good deal of power. At the present time the secret society is very widely spread, and the head of it at this moment is a pupil of one of our masters. Even now after all these centuries its existence is not officially known to the authorities, but as a matter of fact they have something more than a suspicion of it, and they have learnt to fear it. None of its members are actually identified as such, but many are strongly suspected, and it seems to have been observed that when any of these strongly suspected people have in the past been injured or unjustly put to death, the persons who were concerned in bringing about that result have invariably died prematurely and mysteriously, though never in any case has their death been traceable to any physical plane action on the part of the suspected member. Consequently, although such a belief is no doubt somewhat of an infringement of the principles of pure reason by which everything is supposed to be governed, it has come to be generally understood that it is safest not to pry too closely into the beliefs of people who seem to differ in some degree from the majority, so long as they do not openly make profession of anything which would be considered subversive of the good morals of materialism. Driven far away from the pleasant equatorial regions into inhospitable lands and impenetrable forests, there still exist some remnants of the savage tribes who are descended from those left behind when the great life wave left Mars for the Earth. These are primitive savages at a lower stage than any now living on the exterior of our Earth, though bearing some resemblance to one of our interior evolutions. Some at least of the members of the secret society have learned how to cross without great difficulty the space which separates us from Mars, and have therefore at various times tried to manifest themselves through mediums at spiritualistic seances, or have been able, by the methods which they have learnt, to impress their ideas upon poets and novelists. The information which I have given above is based upon observation and inquiry during various visits to the planet. Yet nearly all of it might be found in the works of various writers within the last 30 or 40 years, and in all such cases it has been communicated or impressed by someone from Mars. Although the very fact of such impression was, at least in some cases, quite unknown to the physical writer. Of our future home, Mercury, we know much less than of Mars, for visits to it have been hurried and infrequent. Many people would think it incredible that life such as ours could exist on Mercury, with a sun that appears at least 7 times as large as it does here. The heat, however, is not at all so intense as would be supposed. I am informed that this is due to the presence of a layer of gas on the outskirts of the Mercurian atmosphere, which prevents most of the heat from penetrating. We are told also that the most destructive of all possible storms on Mercury is one which even for a moment disturbs the stability of this gaseous envelope. When that happens a kind of a whirlpool is set up in it, and for a moment a shaft of direct sunlight comes from the sun through its vortex. Such a shaft instantly destroys whatever life comes in its way, and burns up in a moment everything combustible. Fortunately such storms are rare. The inhabitants whom I have seen there are much like ourselves, though again somewhat smaller. The influence of gravity both on Mars and Mercury is less than half what it is on Earth, but while on Mars I did not notice any particular way in which advantage had been taken of this. I observed Mercury that the doors of the houses were quite a considerable height from the ground, needing what for us would be a respectable gymnastic feat to reach them, though on Mercury it is only a slight spring that is required. All the inhabitants of that planet are from birth possessed of etheric sight. I remember that the fact was first brought to my notice by observing a child who was watching the movements of some crawling creature. And I saw that when it entered its abode he was still able to follow its movements, even when it was deep down under the ground. 7th section, Reincarnation. 3 Laws of Human Life. The ordinary ego is by no means yet in a position to choose a body for himself. The place of his birth is usually determined by 3 factors, or perhaps it would be better to say by the combined action of 3 forces. First comes the law of evolution, which cause an ego to be born under conditions which will give him an opportunity of developing exactly those qualities of which he stands most in need. But the action of this force is limited by the second factor, the law of karma. The ego may not have deserved the best possible opportunity, and so he has to put up with the second or third best. He may not even have deserved any great opportunity at all, and so a tumultuous life of small progress may be his fate. A third factor also comes into play, the force of any personal ties of love or hate that the ego may have previously formed. This may modify the action of the first and second forces. For by it a man may sometimes be drawn into a position which he cannot be said to have deserved in any other way than by the strong personal love which he has felt for someone higher in evolution than himself. A man who has worked much beyond the ordinary, a man who had already entered the path which leads to adeptship, may be able to exercise a certain amount of choice as to the country and family of his birth. But such an one will be the first to put aside entirely any wish of his own in the matter, and resign himself absolutely into the hands of the great eternal law. Confident that whatever it brings to him must be far better for him than any selection of his own. Parents cannot choose the soul who shall inhabit the body to which they give birth. But by so living as to offer an unusually good opportunity for the progress of an advanced ego, they can make it exceedingly probable that such an ego will come to them. The return to birth. The whole of our solar system is a manifestation of its logos, and every particle in it is definitely part of his vehicles. All the physical matter of the solar system taken as a totality constitutes his physical body. All the astral matter within it constitutes his astral body, all the mental matter, his mental body, and so on. Entirely above and beyond his system he has a far wider and greater existence of his own, but that does not in the least affect the truth of the statement which we have just made. This solar logos contains within himself 7 planetary logoi, who are as it were centers of force within him, channels through which his force pours out. Yet at the same time there is a sense in which they may be said to constitute him. The matter which we have just described as composing his vehicles also composes theirs, for there is no particle of matter anywhere in the system which is not part of one or other of them. All this is true of every plane. But let us for a moment take the astral plane as an example, because its matter is fluid enough to answer the purposes of our inquiry. And at the same time it is near enough to the physical to be not entirely beyond the limits of our physical comprehension. Every particle of the astral matter of the system is part of the astral body of the solar logos, but it is also part of the astral body of one or other of the 7 planetary logoi. Remember that this includes the astral matter of which your astral body and mine are composed. We have no particle which is exclusively our own. In every astral body there are particles belonging to each one of the 7 planetary logoi, but the proportions vary infinitely. The bodies of those monads which originally came forth through a planetary logos will continue all through their evolution to have more of the particles of that logos than of any other. And in this way people may be distinguished as primarily belonging to one or other of these 7 great powers. In these 7 planetary logoi certain psychic changes periodically occur, perhaps they correspond to inbreathing and outbreathing, or to the beating of the heart with us down here on the physical plane. However that may be, there seem to be an infinite number of possible permutations and combinations of them. Now since our astral bodies are built of the very matter of their astral bodies, it is obvious that no one of these planetary logoi can change astrally in any way without thereby affecting the astral body of every man in the world. Though of course more especially those in whom there is a preponderance of the matter expressing that particular logos. And if it be remembered that we are taking the astral plane merely as an example, and that exactly the same thing is true on all the other planes, we shall then begin to have an idea how important to us the motions of these planetary spirits are. Madame Blavatsky writes of a certain order of supernal beings whom she calls the Lipika, or lords of karma. We are told that their agents in the administration of karma are the 4, really 7, great rulers who are known as the Devarajas or regents of the earth. Each one of them is at the head of a certain vast group of devas and nature spirits, and even of elemental essence. Once more for purposes of explanation let us confine ourselves to astral plane, but always with the memory at the back of our minds that the same thing applies to all the other planes as well. Astral matter as a whole is specially under the control of one of these great ones, but the second subplane of every plane is also to a certain extent under the direction of the same great one. Because that subplane holds the same relation to the plane of which it is a part as the astral plane does to the whole set of planes. Therefore for every subplane there are two influences, the influence of the ruler of the plane as a whole, and the sub-influence of the ruler of the subplane. Now out of this astral matter, every particle of which belongs to the garment of one or other of the seven planetary logoi, and is at the same time under the predominating influence of the Devaraja of the astral plane. And also under the subordinate influence of another Devaraja who indirectly rules its subplane, our astral bodies have to be built. In order to help us to grasp this, let us think of the subplanes of the astral plane as horizontal divisions, and of the types of matter belonging to the seven great planetary logoi as perpendicular divisions crossing these others at right angles. There are still further subdivisions, but we will take no account of them for the present, in order that the broad idea may stand out clearly. This then even already gives us 49 distinctly marked varieties of astral matter, because on each of its subplanes we have matter belonging to each of the planetary logoi. Even taking no account of the further subdivisions, we see that we have already the possibility of an almost infinite number of combinations. So that whatever may be the characteristics of the ego he is able to find an adequate expression for himself. Let us consider the case of an ego who is about to descend into incarnation. We must think of him as resting upon the higher part of the mental plane in his causal body, and having no vehicle lower than that. Since the death of his last physical body he has been drawing steadily inwards, first into his astral and then into his mental vehicle, and at the end of the heaven life he has cast off even the latter. He then rests for a certain period on his own plane, a period which varies, according to the stage of his development. From 2 or 3 days of unconsciousness in the case of an ordinary undeveloped man to a long period of years of conscious and glorious life in that of exceptionally advanced people. Then he begins once more to turn his attention downwards and outwards. As in the course of his upward movement he has withdrawn his attention from the physical and the astral planes respectively, the permanent atoms have passed into a dormant condition, and have ceased the vigorous vibration which is their usual characteristic. The same thing happens to the mental unit at the end of the heaven life, and during his rest on his own plane the ego has these three appendages within himself in a quiescent condition. When he turns his attention once more to the mental plane, the mental unit immediately resumes its activity, and because of that it at once gathers round it such matter as is required to express that activity. Precisely the same thing happens when he turns his attention to the astral atom, and puts his will into that. It attracts to itself material capable of providing him with an astral body of exactly the same type as that which he had at the end of his last astral life. It is necessary to have this fact clearly in mind, that what he thus acquires as he descends is not a ready-made astral body, but simply the material out of which he is to build an astral body in the course of the life which is to follow. In the case of lower-class monads with unusually strong astral bodies, who reincarnate after a very short interval, it sometimes happens that the shade or shell left over from the last astral life still persists. And in that case it is likely to be attracted to the new personality. When that happens it brings with it strongly the old habits and modes of thought, and sometimes even the actual memory of that past life. The astral matter is at first evenly distributed throughout the ovoid. It is only when the little physical form comes into existence in the middle of the ovoid that the astral and mental matter are attracted to it, and begin to mold themselves into its shape, and thereafter steadily grow along with it. At the same time with this change in arrangement the mental and astral matter are called into activity, and emotion and thought appear. The aura of the little baby is comparatively colorless, and it is only as the qualities develop that the colors begin to show. This is the material which is given to him out of which to fashion his astral vehicle, the material which he has earned by the desires and emotions which he allowed to play through him in his previous life. But he is by no means compelled to utilize all this material in building for himself his new vehicle. If he is left entirely to himself, the automatic action of the permanent atom will tend to produce for him, from the materials given, an astral body precisely similar to that which he had in the last life. But there is no reason whatever why all these materials should be used, and if the child is wisely treated and reasonably guided he will be encouraged to develop to the fullest all the germs of good which he has brought over from his previous life, while the evil germs will be allowed to slumber. If that is done these latter will gradually atrophy and drop away from him, and the ego will unfold within himself the opposite virtues, and then he will be free for all his future lives from the evil qualities which those germs indicated. Parents and teachers may help him towards this desirable consummation, not so much by any definite facts which they teach him as by the encouragement which they give to him, by the rational and kindly treatment uniformly accorded to him. And above all by the amount of affection lavished upon him. We must remember that while the higher vehicles, the mental and the astral body, are expressions of the man at his present stage of evolution, as far as that can be expressed in the matter of their respective planes, the physical body is a vehicle or a limitation imposed upon him from without, and is therefore preeminently the instrument of karma. The evolutionary force comes into play in the selection of its materials, but even in this it is at every turn limited and hampered by the karma of the past. The parents have been chosen because they are fitted to give such a body as will be suitable for the development of the ego committed to them, but with every pair of parents there are manifold possibilities. Each of there represents a long line of ancestry, and often a particular parent may be chosen, not for anything that he is or has in himself, but because of some quality which appeared to an unusual degree in one of his ancestors, because he possesses a power which he has not used, though it is latent in his physical body because it is physically descended from that ancestor. In that parent, and in many preceding generations, the faculty to express that quality may have slept entirely without effect, but when there comes into the line an ego which possesses the quality, the faculty to express it leaps out from the dormant into the active condition, and we have a case of what is called reversion to a remote type. In the formation of the physical body there are three principal forces at work: first, the influence of the ego who is intending to take up the new form; secondly, the work of the building elemental formed by the lords of karma; and thirdly, the thought of the mother. Now suppose that an etheric body is about to be formed for an ego in the process of his descent into incarnation. He is himself an ego of a certain type and subtype, and these characteristics of his are impressed upon his physical permanent atom. And this in turn determines which of the perpendicular divisions of etheric matter shall enter into the composition of that etheric body and in what proportion they shall be used. This quality of his, however, does not determine which of the horizontal divisions shall be employed, and in what proportion. That matter is in the hands of the four Devarajas, and will be determined according to the past karma of the man. Each of these Devarajas has vast hosts of assistants at his command, so that no one of the births which are momentarily taking place upon earth is ever overlooked. The Devarajas make a thought form, the building elemental mentioned above, which is charged exclusively with the production of the most suitable physical body that can be arranged for the man. For his evolution he requires a body which has within it certain possibilities. For that purpose he may be born of a parent who himself possesses these qualities, and therefore can directly hand them on, or he may be born of a parent whose ancestors, on one side or the other, possess them, so that the unawakened germs which can respond to them may be handed on by that parent to his offspring. Remember that this elemental, which is put in charge of the development of the physical body, is the joint thought form of the four Devarajas. And that its primary business is to build the etheric mold into which the physical particles of the new baby body are to be built. In building this new etheric body it has four varieties of etheric matter which it can use, the four over which its creators respectively preside, and the type of the etheric body which is produced depends upon the proportion in which these constituents are employed. Remember that the elemental has no power of choice with regard to the perpendicular subdivisions, but it has every freedom with regard to the horizontal kinds of matter. It is quite impossible for us at our present level to understand the working of so mighty a consciousness as that of a Devaraja, so we can only chronicle the fact, without pretending to explain it. That the elemental in doing its work appears somehow not to be entirely separated from the minds which projected it. In some way inexplicable to us it still remains to some modified extent within their consciousness, and in rare cases, where a developed ego is, even at an early age, beginning to take active possession of his body. It would seem that he may come into direct contact with them, and call down upon himself by their consent more karma than they had originally apportioned to him. One who can do that while the elemental is still at its work can also retain during later life this touch with the karmic deities, and therefore his power to appeal to them for further modifications. So far as we have seen, however, this possible modification may be only in the direction of the increase of the karma to be worked out, not in that of its decrease. The awakening of consciousness, which enables an ego thus to come into touch with the Devarajas and to cooperate willingly with them so far as their work with himself is concerned, may commence at any time. So that an ego who was not in touch with them during the working of the elemental which built his physical body may yet, by stupendous efforts along the line of self-development and usefulness, attract their attention later in life and evoke from them a definite response. The germ which is to expand into the physical body of the man has within itself two constituents, with two sets of potentialities. The student must be careful not to confound this physical germ which comes from the parents with the physical permanent atom which the ego brings with him. It is essentially an ovum, which has within itself all the possibilities of the maternal ancestry, but it has been pierced by a spermatozoon which brings with it all the potentialities of the paternal ancestry. These two sets of possibilities are wide, as may easily be seen if we reflect upon the number of ancestors which any one of us must have had, say 1,000 years ago. But wide though they be, they have their limitations. For example, take the case of one of our gardeners here at Udyar, a man of what is called the coolie or unskilled labor class. Going back 1,000 years, that man's ancestors must have been counted by millions. Yet all those millions must have been of the coolie class. They must have included all possible varieties of coolie, good and bad, clever and stupid, kind and cruel. But they were all coolies, and therefore all had the limitations of the brain and the qualities belonging to that class. From among these potentialities the elemental has to make its selection. For that purpose it has two questions to consider, quality and form. Of these the former is infinitely more important. The latter is concerned chiefly with the matter of the lower subplanes. But the quality of the etheric matter selected for the building of that higher part of the physical body will to a large extent determine the capacities of that body during that incarnation, whether it will be naturally clever or stupid, placid or irritable, energetic or lethargic, sensitive or unresponsive. So the first work of the thought form or elemental of the Devarajas is to select which of these possibilities shall be brought into prominence in the building of the new physical body, especially in the building of its brain. The mere outer form is a minor consideration, though also an important one, but this too is part of the work of the elemental. If the man has deserved the limitation of deformity in his physical body or of weakness in some of its organs, the heart, the lungs, the stomach, it is through the elemental that his karma is adjusted. Its instructions, if we may use such a term, are to build a body of a certain kind and degree of strength, and with certain characteristics brought into prominence. But these are not instructions given to it to carry in its mind, for it has no mind. They are rather itself, its very life, for when those instructions have finally been carried out it ceases to be, because the work for which it was created is done. It is a well-known fact to students of embryology that in their earlier stages the germs of a fish, a dog and a man are practically indistinguishable. They all grow in the same manner, but the difference between them is that one of them stops at one stage of that growth, while the others go on further. The reason for this obvious fact is not clear to those who adopt the materialistic view. They have to postulate that matter coming from a particular source, although in every way identical in appearance with matter coming from a totally different source, nevertheless possesses within it some inherent qualities which compel it to reproduce the form from which it came. The compulsory force is not an inherent quality in the matter, which is in truth identical and composed of precisely the same chemical elements, but it is the divine life pressing forward to ensoul this matter, and molding it for itself into the form which is suited for it at that particular stage of its development. As soon as the entity becomes individualized, and therefore commences to make individual karma, this additional factor of the molding thought form of the karmic deities comes into play, and takes possession of the growing germ, even before its own ego can grasp it. The form and color of this elemental vary in different cases. At first it accurately expresses in shape and size the baby body which it has to build, as that body should look, as far as the elemental's work is concerned, at the time of its birth. Clairvoyants, seeing this doll-like little figure hovering about, and afterwards within, the body of the mother, have sometimes mistaken it for the soul of the coming baby, instead of the mold of its physical body. When the fetus has grown to the size of the mold, that much of its task is successfully achieved, and it sheds that outer husk of itself and unfolds the form of the next stage at which it has to aim, the size, shape and condition of the body as it ought to be, taking only the elemental's work into account, at the time when it proposes to leave it. All further growth of the body after the elemental has retired is under the control of the ego himself. In both of these cases the elemental uses itself as the mold. Its colors represent to a large extent the qualities which it is calculated to evoke in the body which it has to build, and its form is also usually that which is destined for him. It exists only for its work, and when the amount of force with which it has originally been supplied is exhausted, there is no longer any power left to hold together the particles, and it simply disintegrates. This elemental takes charge of the body from the first, but some time before physical birth takes place the ego also comes into contact with his future habitation, and from that time onwards the two forces are working side by side. Sometimes the characteristics which the elemental is directed to impose are but few in number, and consequently it is able to retire at a comparatively early age, and to leave the ego in full control of the body. In other cases, where the limitations are of such a character that a good deal of time is necessary for their development, it may retain its position until the body is 7 years old. Egos differ greatly in the interest which they take in their physical vehicles, for some hover over them anxiously from the first and take a good deal of trouble about them, while others are almost entirely careless with regard to the whole matter. When a child is stillborn, there has usually been no ego behind it, and consequently no elemental. There are vast hosts of souls seeking reincarnation, and many of them are still at so early a stage of their evolution that almost any ordinary surroundings would be equally suitable for them. They have so many lessons to learn that it matters little with which one they begin, and almost any conceivable set of surroundings will teach them something which they sorely need. Nevertheless, it does sometimes happen that there is not at a given time any ego able to take advantage of a particular opportunity, and in that case, though the body may be formed to a certain extent by the thought of the mother, as there is no ego to occupy it, it is never really alive. In building the form the elemental takes the etheric matter which it needs from that which it finds ready within the body of the mother. That is one reason for the necessity of the greatest care on the part of that mother during the time the child's body is being formed. If she supplies nothing but the best and purest materials, the elemental will find itself compelled to choose from those. Another factor which has an exceedingly powerful influence is the thought of the mother during this period, for that also molds the shape which is slowly growing within her. Again, this shows us why the mother's thought must at that time be especially pure and high, why she must be kept away altogether from all coarse or agitating influences, why only the most beautiful forms and colors should surround her, and the most harmonious conditions should prevail in her neighborhood. If the elemental's instructions do not include some special development in the way of features, such as unusual beauty or unusual ugliness, that part of the shaping of the new body will most likely be done by the thought of the mother, and by the thought forms which are constantly floating round her. If she thinks often with devoted love of her husband, there is a strong probability that the child will resemble its father. If on the contrary she looks often at her reflection in the mirror and thinks much about herself, it is probable that the child will bear considerable resemblance to her. Equally, if it happens that she is constantly thinking with devoted affection or admiration of some third person, the child is likely to resemble that person, always supposing that the elemental has no definite instructions in this matter. When the children grow older, their physical bodies are influenced largely by their own thoughts, and as these differ from those of the mother, we often see that considerable changes in physical appearance take place. The child in some cases growing more beautiful and in other cases less so as the years roll by. As a man thinks, so is he, is true on the physical plane as well as on others, and if the thought is always calm and serene, the face will surely reflect it. To an advanced ego, all the earlier stages of childhood are naturally exceedingly wearisome. I remember that the late Mr. T. Subba Rao complained quite bitterly about it when he first took his new body. He declared that, do what he would, he could not make that baby body sleep more than 20 hours out of the day, and the rest of the time he actually had to wait near it and watch it squirming about, and listen to its plaintive ululations. And endure to be fed through it with tasteless and nauseous varieties of pap. Sometimes a really advanced person decides to avoid all this by asking someone else to give him an adult body, a sacrifice which any of his disciples would always be delighted to make for him. But this method also has its drawbacks. However wearisome it may be to pass through childhood, at least in that way a man grows a body for himself, which is as nearly as may be an expression of him, and agrees with all his little peculiarities. But one who takes an adult body finds it already full of peculiarities of its own, which have worn in it deep grooves of habit that cannot readily be changed. It cannot but be to some extent a misfit, and it takes a long time to make its vibrations synchronize with his own. An ego coming into incarnation has always to adapt himself to a new set of conditions, but when he comes to birth in the ordinary way this can at least be done gradually, as the child grows up. But one who takes an adult body has instantly to adapt himself to all these fresh surroundings, which is often a very difficult business. In this case he has retained his old astral and mental bodies. But they are naturally counterparts of his previous vehicle, and they have to be adapted to the new form. Once more, if that form be a baby this can be done gradually, but if it is an adult form it must be done immediately, which means an amount of strain that is distinctly unpleasant. Personal characteristics. I have looked up many cases, and I find that for the ordinary man there seems to be but little continuity of personal appearance life after life, but I have known cases of strong similarity as well as great unlikeness. As the physical body is to some extent an expression of the ego, and that remains the same, there must be some cases where it expresses itself in similar forms, but racial, family and other characteristics usually override this tendency. When an individual is so advanced that the personality and ego are unified, the personality tends to have impressed upon it the characteristics of the glorified form in the causal body, which is relatively permanent. When the man is an adept and all his karma is worked out, the physical body is the nearest possible presentment of that glorified form. The masters will therefore remain recognizable through any number of incarnations. I have noticed that one of the masters who comparatively recently attained adeptship is as yet not quite like the others, having somewhat rugged features. I am sure that will be different in the next incarnation. I should not expect to see much difference in the bodies of our masters, even if they should choose to take others, and even though they might be of another race. I have seen prototypes of what bodies are to be like in the seventh race. They will be transcendently beautiful. The glorified form in the causal body is an approach to the archetype, and comes nearer to it as man develops. The human form appears to be the model for the highest evolution in this particular solar system. It is varied slightly in different planets, but is broadly speaking the same in general outline. In other solar systems forms may possibly be quite unlike it, we have no information on that point. Bringing over past knowledge. We do not yet know with any certainty the laws which govern the power to impress the detailed knowledge of one life upon the physical brain of the next. Such evidence as is at present before us seems to show that details are usually forgotten, but that broad principles appear to the new mind as self-evident. Many of us have exclaimed when for the first time in this incarnation we read a theosophical book, "This is exactly what I have always felt, but I did not know how to put it into words." In some cases there seems scarcely that much of memory, yet as soon as the teaching is presented it is instantly recognized as true. Mrs. Besant as Hypatia must unquestionably have known a great deal of this philosophy which was not clearly formulated in her present brain during the orthodox or free-thought periods of this incarnation. If any reliance at all is to be placed upon exoteric tradition, even the Buddha himself, who descended from higher planes with the definite intention of taking birth to help the world, knew nothing clearly of his mission after he had entered his new body, and regained full knowledge only after years of searching for it. Undoubtedly he could have known from the first had he chosen, but he did not choose, he submitted himself to what seems to be the common lot. It is possible that in his case there may be another explanation. The body which was born of King Suddhodana and Queen Maya may not in its earlier years have been inhabited by the Lord Buddha. He may have acted as the Christ did. He may have asked one of his disciples to take care of that vehicle for him until he needed it, and he may have entered it himself only at the moment when it fainted after the long austerities of the 6 years of searching for truth. If this be so, then the reason that Prince Siddhartha did not remember all that the Lord Buddha previously knew was because he was not the same person. But in any case we may be sure that the ego, who is the true man, always knows what he has once learned, but he is not always able to impress it upon his new brain without the help of a suggestion from without. Fortunately for our students, it seems to be an invariable rule that one who has accepted occult truth in one life always comes into contact with it in the next, and so revives his dormant memory. I suppose we may say that the opportunity of thus recovering the truth is the karma of having accepted it, and of having earnestly tried to live according to it in the previous incarnation. There is, however, every probability that much of what we now call distinctively theosophical belief will be the ordinary accepted knowledge of the day by the time that we return to take up again our work on the physical plane. So it may be that we shall all be educated in it as a matter of course. If that be so, the difference between those who have studied it this time and those who have not will be that the former will take it up with enthusiasm and make rapid progress, while to the latter it will mean no more than does the science of today to the entirely unscientific mind. In any case, let no one for a moment suppose that the benefit of our study and hard work can ever be lost. The intervals between lives. A certain amount of misconception exists among students with regard to the average interval which elapses between 2 incarnations. It seems probable that we misunderstood the information given on this subject in the early days of the Society, and the statements then made have been copied without comment even into some of the later books. Most of the closer students have come to know more or less accurately the facts of the case, but so far as I am aware nothing resembling a tabulation of averages for the various classes of egos has yet been published. At the end of the chapter on the heaven world, then called Devachan, in Mr. Sinnott's monumental work Esoteric Buddhism, the statement is made that the whole period between death and the next physical birth varies greatly in the case of different persons. But rebirth in less than 1500 years is spoken of as almost impossible, while the stay in Devachan which rewards a very rich karma is said sometimes to extend to enormous periods. This statement is based upon passages in the same letters from which is derived all the rest of this most interesting book, and there is no question whatever that Mr. Sinnott has quite accurately reported what was told to him. The same general idea is put forward by Madame Blavatsky in The Secret Doctrine, 317. Let us remember that, save in the case of young children and of individuals whose lives have been violently cut off by some accident, no spiritual entity can reincarnate before a period of many centuries has elapsed. In those earlier days we took this 1500 years as an average for humanity, but later investigations have clearly shown us that it could not have been meant exactly in that way. To make the statement square with the observed facts, it must be either greatly limited or greatly extended. If confined to a small group of the most advanced of the human race it would be approximately correct. And on the other hand, if it were extended to include not only humanity but the vast hosts of the Deva kingdom, it might again be taken as coming very near to the truth. In the case of the quotation from The Secret Doctrine, the expression spiritual entities may be read as implying that Madame Blavatsky was speaking only of highly developed persons. But the passage from Esoteric Buddhism gives us 1500 years almost as a minimum. We are given to understand that the letters upon which Esoteric Buddhism was founded were written by various pupils of the masters under their general direction. And so, while there is plenty of room for inaccuracies to creep in, as we know that they have crept in, it is impossible to suppose that the writers did not know facts quite readily accessible to anyone who can watch the process of reincarnation. We must remember that the letter was written not to the world at large but quite definitely to Mr. Sinnott, with possibly a view to the few others who were at that time studying with him. To state such an average for them would be reasonably exact, and perhaps this is what was done, but we certainly cannot accept it as the mean proportion for the whole human race at the present time. It is probably impossible to arrive at a really accurate average, for in order to do that it would be necessary to know at least approximately the number in each of the different classes of monads. Something of the nature of an estimate for each of the main classes may be given, though even then it must be remembered that there will necessarily be wide individual variations on each side of it. Three principal factors have to be taken into account: the class to which an ego belongs, the mode in which he has attained individualization, and the length and nature of his last life. Let us then take up the various classes of humanity in their order, using the nomenclature decided upon by Mrs. Besant in the table facing page 213. Lords of the Moon. At the head of that list appear the Lords of the Moon, those who attained the Arhat level at some time or other during the evolution of the moon chain. For that humanity, as for all others, 7 paths open when they have attained the level assigned to their chain. And in this case one of those paths brought a certain proportion of the Lords of the Moon over to the Earth chain to direct the earlier stages of its evolution. All of these, however, have long since attained adeptship, and we need therefore take no account of them in the consideration of our present subject. Moon Men, First Order. The next class is the First Order of the Moon Men, and that is a class so large and varied that it will be necessary for us to discuss it in the several subdivisions given in the chapter on monads from the moon. 1 and 2. The first class, as given there, includes those who even on the moon chain were already on the path, and the second consists of those who were individualized in the 4th round of the moon chain. In our present chapter we need not consider either of these classes, since their members have attained adeptship, and so the question of incarnations and the intervals between them no longer concerns them. 3. Those who attained individualization in the 5th round of the moon chain. Among these, those who are already on the path are usually taking a continuous succession of incarnations, so that for them the question of the interval between lives does not arise. If, however, they are for some reason not as yet taking the special series of lives which usually follows upon initiation, their intervals are very long, probably at the least 1500 or 2000 years, or even more. Though not so usual as the series of rapid incarnations, this does sometimes occur. For among the cases known to us those who passed the first initiation some considerable time ago, one ego has been taking successive incarnations in physical life ever since, with scarcely any break. While another has been away from physical life for 2,300 years. And yet the result so far as progress on the path is concerned seems to have been exactly the same. The apportioning of the different stages of a long interval like this varies considerably in different cases. The stay upon the astral plane is short, or the ego may even pass through it rapidly and unconsciously. Most of the time is passed in the highest level of the heaven world, and then, after that is over, a certain proportion of conscious life in the causal body precedes the next descent into birth. This life of the ego on its own plane is at this stage only about 1/10 of the entire interval between the earth lives. But this again is a matter in which no two instances are alike. In the case of those who are approaching the path the general interval is not far from 1200 years if the ego has been individualized slowly by intellectual development. And is therefore passing through its blissful experiences at the ordinary rate. If, however, the ego has been individualized suddenly by a rush of emotion or by a stupendous effort of will, and is consequently taking his bliss in the more concentrated form, his interval is about 700 years. Both these types are little likely to stay long upon the astral plane, probably 5 years represents for them an astral life of fair average duration. At the other end of their stay in the heaven world there most likely comes a certain period of conscious life in the ego on its own plane, but this does not exceed half a century at most. During their more recent lives we find that it has been the tendency of those people who take the normal interval of 1200 years to incarnate successively in the different subraces. Often we find them running twice through the same set of subraces, first in male and then in female vehicles, or vice versa. The fates of various people differ greatly. Some go on steadily life after life, but nothing particular happens to them. Others are constantly in trouble, shock following shock, and yet both are advancing along the line which is best for them. It often happens that if a man dies young, he is born again in the same subrace, and when a man goes round the subraces twice, he usually takes the other sex on the second journey. Broadly speaking, the Indians represent the first subrace of the Aryan root race, the Arabs the second, the Parsis the third, the Romance nations the fourth and the Teutons the fifth. If a man takes a birth in France, he does not need one in Italy or Spain, and the same is true of Germany and England. Students taking the 700 years interval seem to have more the habit of attaching themselves to one subrace and returning to it whenever possible, and diverging into others only occasionally in order to develop special qualities. As a general rule, successive incarnations in the same race intensify its characteristics. Equilibrium is brought about by incarnating in various races, or by travel and living among different people. With regard to this matter, the idiosyncrasies of the ego play a considerable part. I mentioned elsewhere how the strong prepossession in the mind of the Jews that they are a special and chosen people tends to bring them back into the same race. And pride of race generally, if unusually intense, is likely to work in that direction. Even pride of family is not without its result also, and I have known of several cases in which, when abnormally developed, it has brought the ego back into the line of his direct descendants 2 or 3 times before he got free. In the beginning of these studies it was given to us as a general rule that a man usually takes not less than 3 and not more than 7 incarnations in one sex before passing over to the other. Although the many researches which we have since undertaken have to a large extent confirmed this general rule, they have also shown us a great number of exceptions to it. Some people taking long lines of incarnations in one sex before turning to the other, and others for a time incarnating alternately in male and female bodies. But most of these were in the case of egos who were already advanced somewhat beyond the average, and were therefore probably receiving special treatment. Evidently there is no hesitation in modifying the general rule to suit particular cases, when for any reason that is seen to be desirable. Though the laws governing reincarnation are allowed to work mechanically upon the vast majority of undeveloped egos, it seems clear from the instances observed that as soon as any one ego makes a little progress of any sort and so becomes hopeful from the evolutionary point of view, considerable elasticity is introduced into the arrangements. And within certain definite limits he is born into the sex, race, and conditions which are best suited to give him an opportunity of strengthening the weak points in his character. In the case of men who have distinguished themselves greatly along artistic, scientific or religious lines, the interval is usually much the same, though the apportioning may differ slightly. The general tendency is to a longer astral and a shorter causal life, especially in the case of the religious and the artistic. A great philosopher sometimes enormously extends his life in the heaven world. I remember that Madame Blavatsky has somewhere stated that Plato would be likely to stay away from Earth for at least 10,000 years, though I imagine that this is an entirely exceptional ease. 4. Those who attained individualization in the 6th round of the moon chain, typical examples of whom are the country gentlemen and professional men. Their intervals vary greatly, say from 600 to 1,000 years, of which perhaps 20 or 25 may be spent upon the astral plane, and all the rest in various stages of the heaven world. There is probably just a touch of consciousness in the ego on its own plane, but only a touch. 5. Those who individualized in the 7th round of the moon chain, the upper middle class. This class generally has an interval between lives of perhaps 500 years, of which about 25 are passed on the astral plane and the rest in the heaven world. In such a case there is no conscious life in the causal body, though of course, like all other human beings, they have the flash of memory and of prescience which is always vouchsafed to each ego when he touches his own plane between 2 physical incarnations. Moon men, 2nd order. The bourgeoisie. Their interval between lives is commonly 200 to 300 years, of which about 40 are usually spent upon the astral plane, and the rest in the lower levels of the heaven world. In this, as in all the other types, individualization may have been obtained by intelligence or by emotion, and there will be a corresponding difference in the average length of the intervals between successive incarnations. But in all these lower classes the difference caused by the mode of individualization is much less in proportion than in the higher class. Moon animal men. The pioneers of the first round of the Earth chain, represented now by the skilled workers of the world. Such men have usually an interval between lives varying from 100 to 200 years, about 40 of which are spent on the middle level of the astral plane, and the rest on some of the lower subplanes of the heaven world. Moon animals, first class. Now the unskilled laborers. Their interval between lives varies from 60 to 100 years, of which from 40 to 50 are spent on the lower parts of the astral plane, and the remainder on the lowest division of the heaven world. Moon animals, second class. The drunkards and the unemployable. Such people are generally absent from the world some 40 or 50 years, which they spend entirely on the astral plane, usually on the lowest subdivision but one. Moon animals, third class. The lowest of humanity. Their interval between lives is often about 5 years, spent on the lowest subplane of the astral, unless they are earthbound by crime, which not infrequently happens. In all the cases mentioned above, a certain difference is produced by the mode of individualization, but this difference is much less in proportion in the lower classes. Still, on the whole, those individualized through intellect tend always to take the longer of the two intervals mentioned as possible for them, whereas those who come along other paths tend to take the shorter. A third factor which exercises great influence is the length and nature of the individual life. Obviously, an ego who casts aside his physical body in childhood has not had the opportunity in that body to generate a sufficient amount of spiritual force to keep him on the higher planes for the length of time common to his type. Generally speaking, then, a man who dies young will have a shorter interval than his neighbor who lives to old age. Generally speaking, again, the man dying young is likely to have a greater proportion of astral life, because most of the strong emotions which work themselves out in astral life are generated in the earlier part of the physical existence. Whereas the more spiritual energy which finds its result in the heaven life is likely to continue until the end or near the end of the period spent upon earth. The character of the man during his earth life is a consideration of the utmost importance. Some men lead a long life in which there is scarcely anything of spirituality, and that naturally tends to shorten the interval between their incarnations and brings it far below what is common for their class. Probably, too, in such a case quite an undue proportion of the interval would be spent on the astral plane. The averages given, therefore, are only averages, and it must be clearly understood that a wide range on each side of them is usually possible, so that the various classes may considerably overlap one another. We have only recently come to understand the importance, in this regard, of strong mutual affection. From our study of past lives it has become clear to us that egos are closely associated in families or group, and that this connection tends on the whole to equalize the intervals between the lives of the members of such a group. It is evidently considered necessary that they should prepare for future work together by constant association as they evolve. And it is manifest that intervals which would otherwise be shorter or longer are so dealt with as to bring the entire party into incarnation together, not once but many times. This unquestionably involves an increase or decrease of the rate at which the spiritual force discharges itself, and it is clear that this must be a matter of careful regulation by the authorities in charge of evolution. Though we have not yet discovered the exact law which regulates it, there is little doubt that when we do we shall find that it works automatically, so that the maximum of result may be achieved without injustice to any individual concerned. There seems to be a type of students who are always yearning to discover injustice in the working of the evolutionary machinery. But those who have spent many years in the investigation of the processes of nature know more and more certainly as they go on that injustice is an impossibility. And that any case in which we think we descry it is only a case in which our knowledge is as yet imperfect. Those who have probed the mysteries of nature most deeply are precisely those who have acquired the utter certainty that he who doeth all things well. 8th section, Karma. The law of equilibrium. When we are considering the life of man we have three principal forces to take into account, all interacting and limiting one another: the steady pressure of evolution, the law of cause and effect which we call karma, and the free will of man. The action of the evolutionary force has, so far as we can see, no reference whatever to the man's pleasure or pain, but only to his progress, or rather his opportunities for progress. One would say that it was absolutely indifferent as to whether the man was happy or unhappy, and that it might press him sometimes into one of these conditions and sometimes into the other, according to what was best calculated to afford opportunity for the development of the particular virtue on the formation of which he is for the moment engaged. Karma appears as the manifestation of the action of the man's free will in the past. He has accumulated energies which either afford opportunities for the evolutionary force, or limit it in its operation. Then the man's present use of such free will as he possesses is a third factor. The doctrine of karma explains that advancement and well-being are the results of well-doing. But there should be no mistake as to exactly what is meant by well-doing and well-being respectively. The object of the entire scheme is, so far as we are concerned, the evolution of humanity. And consequently the man who does best is he who does most to help forward the evolution of others as well as his own. The man who does this to the utmost extent of his power and opportunity in one life will certainly find himself in the next in possession of greater power and wider opportunities. These are not unlikely to be accompanied by worldly wealth and power, because the very possession of these usually gives the opportunity required, but they are by no means a necessary part of the karma. And it is important for us to bear in mind that the result of usefulness is always the opportunity for further and wider usefulness. And we must not consider the occasional concomitants of that opportunity as themselves the reward of the work done in the last incarnation. One instinctively shrinks from the use of such words as reward and punishment, because they seem to imply the existence, somewhere in the background, of an irresponsible being who deals out both at will. We shall get a truer idea of the way in which karma works if we think of it as a necessary readjustment of equilibrium disturbed by our action, as a kind of illustration of the law that action and reaction are always equal. It will also help us much in our thinking if we try to take a broader view of it, to regard it from the point of view of those who administer its laws rather than from our own. Though the inevitable law must sooner or later bring to each man unerringly the result of his own work, there is no immediate hurry about it. In the counsels of the Eternal there is always time enough, and the first object is the evolution of humanity. Therefore it is that one who shows himself a willing and useful instrument in forwarding that evolution always receives as his reward the opportunity of helping it still further, and thus, in doing good to others, to do best of all for himself. Of course, if the thought of self-advancement were his motive for thus acting, the selfishness of the idea would vitiate the action and narrow its results. But if, forgetting himself altogether, he devotes his energies to the single aim of helping in the great work, the effect upon his own future will undoubtedly be as stated. A definite protest ought once for all to be entered against the theory that suffering is the necessary condition of spiritual progress. Exercise is the condition of attaining physical strength, but it need not be painful exercise. If a man is willing to take a walk every day, there is no need to torture him on the treadmill in order to develop the muscles of his legs. For spiritual progress a man must develop virtue, unselfishness, helpfulness, that is to say, he must learn to move in harmony with the great cosmic law. And if he does this willingly there is no suffering for him but that which comes from sympathy with others. Granted that at the present time most men refuse to do this, that when they set themselves in opposition to the great law suffering invariably follows. And that the eventual result of many such experiences is to convince them that the path of wickedness and selfishness is also the path of folly. In this sense it is true that suffering conduces to progress in those particular cases. But because we willfully elect to offend against the law, and thereby bring down suffering upon ourselves, we have surely no right so to blaspheme the great law of the universe as to say that it has ordered matters so badly that without suffering no progress can be made. As a matter of fact, if a man only will, he can make far more rapid progress without suffering at all. It must, however, be remembered that any man who has once realized the glorious goal which lies before us can never be perfectly happy until he has attained that goal, and that he finds an ever-present source of dissatisfaction in his own failings. Now even dissatisfaction is a modified form of suffering, and from that no man can hope to be free until the imperfection has been outgrown. God, thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are ever restless till they find their rest in thee. Whether it is comforting or the reverse to know that one's sufferings are deserved may be a matter of opinion, but that in no way alters the undoubted fact that unless they had been so deserved they could not possibly come to us. It is lamentable that so many people should adopt the unphilosophical and indeed childish attitude which leads them to assume that any idea which does not fall in with their particular sectarian preconceptions cannot possibly be true. Unintelligent people constantly say, "The theosophical teaching about karma does not seem to me so comfortable as the Christian idea of forgiveness of sins," or "The theosophical heaven world does not seem so real and beautiful as the Christian. And so I will not believe in it." They evidently think poor creatures that their likes and dislikes are powerful enough to alter the laws of the universe, and that nothing of which they do not approve can possibly be on any plane. We, however, are engaged in studying the facts of existence, which after all are not modified because Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so would rather believe them to be otherwise than they are. If it were possible for anyone to be an innocent victim, there would be no certainty of the operation of the great law of cause and effect anywhere in the universe. Which would be a far more terrible thing for us than having to work out the results of any amount of sin committed in former lives. It can never be too strongly emphasized that the law of karma is not the vindictive vengeance of some angry deity, but simply an effect naturally and inevitably following upon its cause in obedience to the action of universal law. Every individual will have to pay to the utmost every debt that he contracts, and to every individual the most perfect justice will be done. But for this purpose it is not always necessary that a vast crowd of egos should be perpetually meeting one another in successive lives. If one man so acts towards another as seriously to hasten or retard his evolution, if he does anything which produces upon the other a marked or permanent effect, it is fairly certain that the two must meet again in order that the debt may be adjusted. It is obvious that that may be done in various ways. A man who murders another may conceivably sometimes himself be murdered in turn in another incarnation. But he can cancel the karma much more satisfactorily if he happens to have an opportunity in that next incarnation of saving the life of his former victim at the cost of his own. It would seem that sometimes he may cancel it without losing his own at all. For among the many lines of lives which have been examined we found at least one case in which a murderer apparently fully expiated his fault by patiently devoting the whole of a later life to the service of the person whom he had previously slain. There is a vast amount of minor karma which appears to go into what may be described as a kind of general fund. The schoolboy who mischievously pinches a classmate will certainly not have to meet that classmate 1,000 years hence under other skies in order to be pinched by him in return. Though it is unquestionable that even in so small a matter as this perfect justice will be done to both the parties. Constantly as we pass on through life we shower small kindnesses upon those whom we meet, carelessly and often unconsciously we do them small injuries in thought and word and deed. Every one of these brings its corresponding result of good or evil to ourselves, and we too, though we knew it not, were the agents of karma in those very actions. The small kindness which we attempt will prove a failure if the recipient does not deserve even that much of help. The careless slight will pass unnoticed by its victim if there has been nothing in his past for which it is a fitting retribution. It is not easy to draw the line between these two classes of karma, that which necessitates personal adjustment and that which goes into the general fund. It is certain that whatever influences a person seriously belongs to the first category, and small everyday troubles belong to the second. But we have at present no means of knowing exactly how much influence must be exerted in order that an action may rank in the first class. We must remember that some of the greatest and most important of all karma can never be personally repaid. In all our line of lives, past and future, no benefit can be greater than that which the masters have conferred upon us in giving us access to the theosophical teaching. Yet to them as individuals we can make absolutely no return, since they are far beyond the need of anything that we can do. Yet even this stupendous debt must be discharged like all the rest. But the only way in which we can ever repay it is by handing on the knowledge to others. So we see that here is another kind of karma which may be said to go into the general fund, though not quite in the same sense as before. A Karent asks, If it is a man's karma to have scarlet fever, by what mechanism is the result brought about? I do not think that, in the sense in which the questioner means it, it ever is a man's karma to have scarlet fever. It is his karma in a given incarnation to have as the result of his actions in past lives a certain amount of physical suffering, and if a scarlet fever germ happens to be at hand when he is in a sensitive condition, it may be permitted to fasten upon him, and part of that debt of suffering may be discharged in that way. But if such a germ does not happen to be there at the moment, one of cholera or tuberculosis will do just as well, or instead of a disease there may be a broken limb caused by a bit of orange peel on the pavement or by a passing motor car. I am aware that there are books which lay down with great precision the exact type of karma which follows upon certain action, as, for example, that if a man is rude to his father in one incarnation he will be born lame of the right leg in the next, whereas if it is with his mother that he has a difference of opinion it will be the left leg which is affected, and so on. But in the many lines of lives which we have examined in order to study the working of karma we have found no such rigidity. On the contrary, we were especially struck no less by the wonderful flexibility of karma than by its unerring certainty. By no possible effort can the man escape a single featherweight of the suffering destined for him, but he may often avoid it in one shape only to find it inexorably descending upon him in a different form, from some unsuspected quarter. Just as a debt of £10 can be paid in a single note, in two smaller notes, in gold or silver, or even in a bag full of copper, so a certain amount of karma may come in one terrible blow. In a number of successive but less severe blows of various kinds, or even in a long series of comparatively petty annoyances. But in any and every case the full tale must be paid. The same sin, committed under the same circumstances by two exactly similar people, must result in the same amount of suffering, yet the kind of suffering might be almost infinitely varied, according to the requirements of the case. Take as an example one of the very commonest of failings, and let us think what would be the probable result of selfishness. This is primarily a mental attitude or condition, so we must look for its immediate result on the mental plane. It is undoubtedly an intensification of the lower personality at the expense of the individuality, and one of its results will therefore certainly be the accentuation of that lower personality. So that selfishness tends to reproduce itself in aggravated form, and to grow steadily stronger. Thus more and more of the higher would be lost in each life through entanglement with the lower, and persistence in this fault would be a fatal bar to progress. For nature's severest penalty is always deprivation of the opportunity for progress, just as her highest reward is the offering of such opportunity. So here we have already a glimpse of the way in which selfishness may itself bring about its own worst result, in so hardening the man as to make him insensible to all good influences, and to render his further progress impossible until he had conquered it. There would also be the karma on the physical plane of all the unjust or unkind acts which the man's selfishness might lead him to commit. But the worst penalty that those could bring upon him would be trivial and evanescent beside the effect upon his own mental condition. It is possible that one result might be that he would be drawn by affinity into the society of selfish people, and so through suffering from this vice in others he would learn how heinous it is in himself. But the resources of the law are endless, and we mistake if we imagine it as cramped down to the line of action on which we in our ignorance think it ought to be administered. A large proportion of the man's suffering is what Mr. Sinnett calls ready money karma, that is to say, it is not due to the result of actions in past lives, and not in any real sense necessary at all. But his actions, in spite of examples put before him and advice freely given to him, are so foolish, and his ignorance is so invincible, so apparently perverse, that he is constantly involving himself in suffering the causes of which are transparently obvious and readily evitable. I do not think that I exaggerate when I say that 9/10 of the suffering of the ordinary man is utterly unnecessary, for it is not the result of the distant past, but is simply the outcome of the mistaken action or foolish attitude of this present life. Another point to be taken into account is that man in his calculations so often fails to discriminate between good and evil effects. The average man regards death as the greatest of all evils, either for himself or for his friends. Yet in many cases karma grants it as a reward. It is, indeed, hardly ever an evil or a punishment, but simply an incident, a kind of move in the game, inevitable at certain intervals, but at all times available as a temporary solution of a difficult position when it is seen to be desirable. It is rarely a matter of anything approaching the importance which is commonly attributed to it. If we can conceive two newly formed egos standing side by side, absolutely primitive and karmaless, and one of them should kill the other, or, indeed, act in any way with regard to the other, a result would be produced which would be, strictly speaking, undeserved. I doubt whether any such condition ever exists, for I think that the individualized animal brings over something of karma into his first human birth. Many animals have a sense of right and wrong, or at least a knowledge that some things ought to be done and that others ought not to be done, and they are capable of feeling ashamed when they have done what they think to be wrong. They have in many cases a power of choice, they can exercise, or not exercise, patience and forbearance, and where there is a power of choice there must be responsibility, and consequently karma. The savage animal becomes a savage and cruel man. The gentle and patient animal becomes a gentle and kindly man, however primitive he may be. This serious difference is clearly the consequence of karma made in the animal kingdom. Such karma must inhere in the group soul, but must be equally distributed through it, so that when a portion breaks off as an individual, it will carry within it its share of that karma. It may be said that that only pushes our difficulty a little farther back, for there must be a first step sometime, and we must technically consider the result of that first step as unjust. Not necessarily. Let us suppose the first step to be a fight between two animals. The wish to kill or wound would be equally present in both. The karma of that wish would in the case of the vanquished be worked out at once by death, whereas the victor would still owe a debt which would probably be discharged later by his own death by violence. In considering the case of humanity, however, we need not indulge in any such speculations. We have behind us a great mass of accumulated energy of both kinds, desirable and undesirable, and I can hardly imagine any conceivable accident that would not suit as an expression for some part of its infinite variety. Therefore shipwreck or financial ruin does not discriminate, because it need not. There is always something which can work itself out in that way in the whole mass of karma which lies behind an ordinary man. In the rare cases where there is nothing remaining which can so work itself out, the man cannot be injured, and is therefore what is commonly called miraculously saved. Nothing could be more wildly absurd than the idea that anything we can do can prevent the working out of karma. For example, if a child is born under circumstances which lead to its being cruelly treated, no doubt such treatment is in accordance with its previous karma. But if kindly intervention delivers it from the demons in human form who torment it, then that intervention also is in accordance with its karma. If it were not, then the well-intentioned effort to rescue it would fail, as we know it sometimes does. Our obvious duty is to do all the good we can, and to render all the help within our power in every direction. And we need have no haunting fear that in doing so we are interfering with the work of the great karmic deities, who are assuredly perfectly capable of managing their business with absolute exactitude, whatever we do or do not do. Does karma seem merciless? If that adjective can be correctly applied to the working of nature's laws, I suppose we must admit that it is so, just as the law of gravitation is. If a child slips over the edge of a precipice, no matter how sad may be the circumstances surrounding the slip, he usually falls to the bottom of that precipice just as effectually as would an older and more responsible person. If a man seizes a red-hot iron bar, he is equally burnt whatever may have been his object in seizing it, or whether he knew that it was hot or not. Yet it would hardly occur to us to think of the bar or the precipice as merciless, or to blame the law of gravitation or the law of the radiation of heat. Does not exactly the same thought apply in the case of karma? The method of karma. It is scarcely possible to put into words the appearance presented to clairvoyant vision on the higher planes by the working of this law of karma. It seems as though the man's action built cells or channels stored with energy, through the reactions of which he can be reached by the law of evolution. The appearance is as though all sorts of forces are playing round him, but they are able to influence him only by acting through these energies which he has himself set in motion. He is continually adding to the number of these cells or channels of energy, and so is continually modifying the possibilities of reaching him. It is in meeting and dealing with all these kaleidoscopic changes, and yet in spite of them all getting in its work and accurately performing its task, that the marvelous and all but incredible adaptability and versatility of karma is exhibited. There is another aspect of karma the consideration of which I have found helpful in the effort to understand its working, but it belongs to a plane so high that it is unfortunately impossible to put it clearly into words. Imagine that we see each man as though he were absolutely alone in the universe, the center of an incredibly vast series of concentric spheres. Every thought, or word, or action of his sends out a stream of force which rushes towards the surfaces of the spheres. This force strikes the interior surface of one of the spheres, and, being at right angles to it, is necessarily reflected back unerringly to the point from which it came. From which sphere it is reflected seems to depend upon the character of the force, and this also naturally regulates the time of its return. The force which is generated by some action strikes a sphere comparatively near at hand, and is reflected back very quickly, while other forces rush on almost to infinity, and return only after many lives. But in any case they inevitably return, and they can return nowhere but to the center from which they came forth. Each man makes his own spheres, and the play of his forces is in no way affected by the action of those sent up by his neighbor, for they cross one another without interfering, just as do the rays of light from two lamps. And the medium through which they move is frictionless, so that the amount of force which returns is precisely that which the man himself has generated. The prarabdha karma of an individual, that is, the karma selected by the authorities for him to discharge in his present life, divides itself into two parts. That which is to express itself in his physical body is made by the devarajas into the thought form or elemental which builds the body, of which we have spoken in a previous section. But the other and far larger block which is to indicate his fate through life, the good or evil fortune which is to come to him, this is made into another thought form which does not descend. Hovering over the embryo, it remains upon the mental plane. From that level it broods over the man and takes or makes opportunities to discharge itself by sections, sending down from itself a flash like lightning to strike, or a finger to touch, sometimes far down on the physical plane. Sometimes a sort of extension which reaches only the astral plane, and sometimes what we may call a horizontal flash or finger upon the mental plane. This elemental goes on discharging itself until it is quite empty, and then, like the other, it fades into nothingness, or more correctly is disintegrated and returns to the matter of the plane. The man can modify its action by the new karma which he is constantly making, by the new causes which he is perpetually setting up. The ordinary man has usually scarcely will enough to create any strong new causes, and so the elemental empties itself of its contents according to what may be described as its original program. Taking advantage of convenient astrological periods and surrounding circumstances, which make its work easier or more effective. And so the horoscope of the man may work out with considerable exactitude. But if the man be sufficiently developed to possess a strong will, the elemental's action is likely to be much modified, and the life will by no means follow the lines laid down in the horoscope. Sometimes the modifications introduced are such that the elemental is unable fully to discharge himself before the time of the man's death. And in that case whatever is left of him is again absorbed into the great mass of the Sankita karma, that which has not yet been worked out. And out of that another and more or less similar elemental is made ready for the beginning of the next physical life. The great mass of the accumulated karma can also be seen hovering over the ego. Usually it is not a pleasant sight, because by the nature of things it contains more evil than good result. In the earlier days of their development in the remote past, most men have done many things that they should not have done, and thereby have laid up for themselves as a physical result a good deal of suffering on this lowest plane. In the present day all civilized beings have risen at least to the level of good intention, and consequently there is much less of directly evil karma being made by such people. We all do foolish things at times, we all make mistakes. But still on the whole the average civilized being is trying to do good and not harm, and therefore on the whole is likely to be making more good karma than bad. But by no means all of the good karma goes into that great accumulated mass, and so we get the impression in that of a preponderance of evil over good. The result of most good thoughts or good actions is to improve the man himself, to make one or other of his bodies vibrate in response to higher forces, or to bring out in him qualities of courage, determination, affection, devotion, which he did not possess in so full a measure before. All this effect then shows in the man himself and in his vehicles, but not in the mass of piled-up karma which is waiting for him. If, however, he does some good action definitely with the thought of its reward in his mind, good karma for that good action will come to him, and will store itself up with the rest of the accumulation until such time as it may be brought forward and materialized into activity. This good karma naturally binds the man to earth just as effectually as evil karma, and consequently the man who is aiming at real progress learns to do all actions absolutely without thought of self or of the result of his action. Because if there is no thought of self, results of the ordinary kind cannot touch him. Not that the man can escape the benefit of a good deed, any more than he can escape the result of an evil deed. But if the man thinks of the reward that will come to him, he will receive the benefit in the shape of that reward, whereas if he forgets himself entirely and does this thing out of the fullness of his heart, because it is the right thing to do and therefore he can do no other, then the whole force of the result is spent in the building of his own character, and nothing of it remains to bind him to the lower planes. The fact is that in each case the man gets what he wants. As the Christ said himself, "Verily I say unto you, they have their reward." The man who thinks of good result to himself obtains that good result. The male who is not thinking of himself at all, or thinking only of making himself a channel for the forces of the Logos, is made into a better channel as the result of the action which that thought prompted. Another complication is introduced by the fact that many people do good deeds in the name of and for the sake of some other, and in that way they make that other a partaker with them of the results. Many a man does a good deed in the name of the Christ, or if he be a theosophist, in that of the Master, and justice demands that in such a case, since it is the thought of the Christ or the Master which has produced this result, something of the effect must go to the great person in question. In this way vast stores of helpful magnetism are constantly at the disposal of those great ones to whom many send thoughts of affection and devotion, in whose name many kindly deeds are done. Naturally it would be utterly impossible that the result of such action should in any way bind the Great One. It simply provides him with additional spiritual force for the work which he has in hand. The karma of death. It is by no means certain that in the majority of cases a time for death is definitely appointed by the lords of karma at all. The whole arrangement is far more elastic and adaptable than most students suppose. The clue to its comprehension lies in never forgetting that there are three great types of karma, which the Indians call Sankita, Prarabdha and Kriyamana. The first is the whole vast mass of unexhausted karma, good or bad, which still waits to be worked out, let us call it mass karma. The second is that particular part of the first which has been selected to be worked out in this incarnation. Let us call it the man's destiny for this life. The third is the new karma which we are constantly making by our present actions. It is the karma of the second type that the astrologer or the palmist tries to read. And his calculations are often invalidated by intrusions from the other two varieties. It is quite certain that nothing can happen to a man which is not in the great mass of his karma, but unquestionably something may happen which was not originally included in his destiny for this life. Suppose the case of a man on board a vessel which is about to be wrecked, or in the first car of a train which is about to come into collision. It may or may not be in the destiny appointed for this particular life that that man should die about this time. If it is, he will no doubt be killed. If it is not, he may be saved, if such saving does not involve too great an interference with the ordinary laws of nature. I think we may say that he probably will be saved if the prolongation of his physical life would appreciably hasten his evolution. It is intended that in each life some lesson should be learnt, some quality developed. If that life work is already done, or if, on the other hand, it is obvious that the man will not succeed in doing it this time, no matter how long he lives, he has nothing to gain by continued physical life. And he may just as well be delivered from it. Also, if there be in the vast mass of his previous karma some debt that can be adequately cancelled by whatever of physical or mental suffering may be involved in such a death, the opportunity of that cancellation may very well be taken when it thus offers itself, even though it may not have been included in the original plan for this particular life. But if in the whole of the mass karma there is nothing that will fit in with such a death, the man simply cannot die that way, and he will inevitably be saved, even though it be by means which seem miraculous. We hear of such cases in which a huge beam has fallen so as just to save a man from being crushed by the superincumbent weight of the wreckage, or in which when an ocean steamer has gone down with all hands, one man has somehow floated ashore on a hencoop. We must not forget the influence on our destiny of that third variety of karma which we are making for ourselves every day. A man may be doing such good work that for the moment he cannot be spared. He may or he may not have acted so as to deserve release from the physical plane at that particular period. Our tendency is to attach an altogether exaggerated importance to the time and the manner of our death. If for a moment we try to imagine how the matter must present itself to the great beings in charge of our evolution, we shall gain a much truer appreciation of relative values. To them the progress of the egos in their charge is the one matter of importance. They know the lessons to be learnt, the qualities to be developed. They must regard it much as a schoolmaster regards the amount of work which a boy has to do before qualifying himself for entrance to the university. The schoolmaster divides that work according to the time at his disposal. So much must be done in each year, and the year's work in turn must be subdivided into terms and even into days. But he will allow himself a considerable amount of latitude with regard to these minor divisions. He may decide to devote 2 days instead of 1 to some specially difficult point, or he may close a lesson earlier than he intended if its object is clearly achieved. Our lives are exactly these days of school life, and the lesson may be lengthened or shortened as the teacher sees to be best. Death is merely the release from school at the end of 1 day's lesson. We need not trouble ourselves about it in the least, we should thankfully accept it whenever karma permits it to us. We must realize that the one important thing is that the appointed lesson should be learnt. The sections into which that lesson shall be divided, the length of the various lesson hours, and exactly when they shall begin or end, all these are details which we may well leave to the agents of the great law. From this point of view no death can be described as premature, for we may always be absolutely certain that what comes to us from without is what is best for us. Our business is to do our very best with each life, and to make every effort to retain it as long as possible. If we ourselves cut it short by recklessness or improper living, we are responsible, and the effect will assuredly be prejudicial. But if it is cut short by something entirely beyond our control, we may be sure that the curtailment is for our good. Nevertheless, what has been written in some of our books about premature death is quite true. In extreme old age desire fades away, and so something of the work of the astral life is already done before the man leaves the physical plane. A similar result is achieved by long sickness, and so in either of these cases the astral life is likely to be comparatively short and without serious suffering. This may be called the ordinary course of nature, and it is only by comparison with it that an earlier death may be spoken of as premature. If a person dies in youth, desire is still strong, and therefore a stronger and more strenuous astral life may be expected, a condition on the whole less desirable. But if the powers behind decided that an earlier death is best, we may feel sure that they know of other considerations which outweigh the prolongation of the astral life. It seems probable, therefore, that in the majority of cases the exact time and manner of a man's death is not decided before or at his birth. Astrologers tell us that in many instances they cannot actually foretell the death of the subject whose horoscope they are examining. They say that at a certain time malefic influences are strong, and the man may die then, but if he does not, his life will continue until a certain other occasion when evil aspects threaten him, and so on. In the same way a palmist will tell us that at such and such points there are serious breaks or markings upon the lifeline, they may indicate death, or it may be only serious illness. It is likely that these uncertainties represent points which were left open for later decisions, depending largely upon the modifications introduced by the action of the man during his life, and by the use which he makes of his opportunities. At any rate, we may be well assured that whatever decision is made it will be a wise one, and that, whether in death or in life, all things are working together for our good. Karma as an educator. No man can ever receive what he has not earned, and all things come to us as the result of causes which we ourselves have set in motion. If we have caused anything, we have also caused its result, for the cause and the effect are like the two sides of a coin, we cannot have one without the other. Indeed, the result comes upon us as part of our original action, which may be said in this case to be still continuing. Everything which comes to us is our own doing, good and bad alike, but it is also being employed definitely for our good. The payment of the debt is being utilized to develop the man who owes it, and in paying it he may show patience, courage, and endurance in the face of adverse circumstances. People constantly grumble against their circumstances. A man will say, "I cannot do anything, situated as I am, with so many cares, with so much business, with so large a family. If only I had the liberty which so-and-so has." The man does not realize that these very hindrances are part of his training, and that they are put in his way just in order to teach him how to deal with them. He would like no doubt to have some opportunity of showing off the powers which he has already developed, but what is needed is that he should develop the powers which he has not, and this means hard work and suffering, but also rapid progress. There is assuredly no such thing as punishment and reward, but there is the result of our actions, which may be pleasant or unpleasant. If we upset the equilibrium of nature in any way, it inevitably readjusts itself at our expense. An ego sometimes chooses whether he will or will not take certain karma in the present life, though often the brain-mind may know nothing of this choice. So that the very adverse circumstances at which a man is grumbling may be exactly what he has deliberately chosen for himself in order to forward his evolution. When he is becoming a disciple, and is therefore somewhat out of the stage of evolution which is normal at present, he often dominates and largely changes his karma, not that he can escape his share, or any least portion of it, but that he gains much new knowledge and therefore sets in motion new forces in many directions, which naturally modify the working of the old ones. He plays off one law against another, thus neutralizing forces whose results might hinder his progress. It has often been said that the disciple who takes steps to hasten his own progress thereby calls down suffering upon himself. That is not perhaps quite the best way to put it. All that he does is to take his own evolution earnestly in hand, and to endeavor, as rapidly as may be, to eradicate the evil and develop the good within himself, in order that he may become ever a more and more perfect living channel of the divine love. It is true that such action will assuredly attract the attention of the great lords of karma, and while their response will be to give him greater opportunity, it may and often does involve a considerable increase of suffering in various ways. But if we think carefully, we shall see that this is exactly what might be expected. All of us have more or less of evil karma behind us, and until that is disposed of, it will be a perpetual hindrance to us in our higher work. One of the earliest steps in the direction of serious progress is therefore the working out of whatever of this evil still remains to us. And so the first response of the great ones to our upward striving is frequently to give us the opportunity of paying off a little more of this debt, since we have now made ourselves strong enough to do it, in order that it may be cleared out of the way of our future work. The manner in which this debt shall be paid is a matter which is entirely in their hands and not in ours. And we can trust them to manage it without inflicting additional suffering upon others, unless of course those others have also some outstanding karmic debt which can be discharged in this way. In any case, the great karmic deities cannot act otherwise than with absolute justice to every person concerned, whether directly or remotely. Varieties of karma. The karma of service done is always the opportunity for more service. This is one of the rules which emerge with the greatest certainty from our study of the working of karma in the many past lives which have been examined. When a man leads a particularly good life, it by no means follows that in the next one he will be rich or powerful or even comfortable, but it does absolutely follow that he will have wider opportunities for work. Clearly the Logos wants his work done, and if we wish for opportunities of progress we must show that we are willing to work. Knowledge brings responsibility, along with opportunity. To yield to what you know to be wrong, or to go back a step in order to gain force for a greater spring forward, is to miss your opportunity. Lives may pass before you gain the same opportunity again. If you neglect the knowledge or vision which points out to you a fault, you will certainly be born in the next life without that knowledge or vision. Knowledge should always be used. It is a mistake to think that you can postpone your activity and retain the knowledge. We may make for ourselves most unpleasant future conditions if we choose to behave foolishly. But it is practically impossible for us who are now cultured people to throw ourselves back in a future birth into the position of savages or people of really low class. We may waste our time and make no progress, but unless we actually take to the practice of black magic, and use tremendous power in the wrong direction, we cannot throw ourselves back as far as that. Through misconduct or through neglect of opportunities we may be born in an uncomfortable position in our own class, or even in one a little lower, but it would upset the scheme of things if we could be thrown back into the savage state. Exceptional actions sometimes produce exceptional results, but as a general rule violent ups and downs are not practical. Obviously it would be impossible for a cultured man to work out the kind of karma which in his position he must have made, if he were thrown back into the narrow conditions of an ignorant agricultural laborer. For the plans of the Logos an ever-increasing number of cultured people are needed, and therefore when once a man is born into a noble position he is on whole likely to continue to be so born. There are, however, certain kinds of action which bring unusually horrible karma as their results. For example, the karma of cruelty of any kind, whether to men or to animals, is always especially awful in character. It often brings with it chronic physical ailments, accompanied by most acute sufferings, and often also it produces insanity, this last more especially when the cruelty is of a refined and intentional character. We have found, for example, that many members of the ignorant mob who tortured Hypatia in Alexandria have been reborn in Armenia, and have themselves suffered all sorts of cruelties at the hands of the Turks. People who are now, apparently by accident, burnt to death with awful sufferings are often those who have burnt others in the Middle Ages, or looked on with glee at those ghastly scenes of martyrdom. Any injury done to a highly developed person reacts terribly upon the doer. We should indeed be careful about our attitude towards any great one who may come, for he, being far in advance of us, is likely to be misunderstood, to be different from what we have expected, and therefore not to be appreciated. One reason why the great ones do not more often come amongst men is that the karma of misjudging and ill-using them is dreadful, and the fools among mankind are sure to incur it. I have myself seen a case in which a great soul, born where he was not understood, fell when young into the hands of a brutal and incompetent pedagogue who shamefully abused him. I have also been allowed to see the karma which will follow upon that cruelty, and I shudder when I think of it. Truly may it be said of that miserable wretch, in the words attributed to the Christ, that before he had offended one of these little ones, it had been better for him that a millstone had been hanged about his neck, and he had been drowned in the depths of the sea. Closely associated with this is the subject of the karma of ingratitude, which is always exceptionally heavy, most of all when the ingratitude is shown to an occult teacher. People are constantly pressing forward, desiring to come into touch with the masters, to attract their attention. And they sometimes think that the pupils of those masters try to hold them back, or at any rate decline to assist them in their efforts to approach. The pupil of the masters exists only to help others, and nothing pleases him more than to draw another to the feet where he has learned so much himself. But when he sees from the type of the aspirant that he does not yet understand those great ones, that his attitude towards them is captious, irreverent, presumptuous, he will take no responsibility in the matter. For he knows that serious disaster is certain to result. A man of such temperament is sure to make bad karma anywhere. It would be foolish to put him into a position where he can multiply it 100-fold. For example, I have noticed cases in which people who have been deeply devoted to our president change their minds, and begin to abuse and slander her. That is a wicked thing, and it makes far worse karma than would be the maligning of a person to whom they owed nothing. I do not mean that people have no right to change their minds. If a man finds that he can no longer conscientiously follow our president, he has a full right to withdraw himself from among her disciples. We may regret his blindness, but we have no word of blame for him, for each man must do what he sees to be right. For such a departure there is no evil karma but that of the loss of opportunity, the ordinary result of failing in a test and making a serious mistake. But if after dropping away the man begins venomously to attack her and to circulate scandalous falsehoods against her, as so many have done, he is committing a very grave sin, and the karma of his action is exceedingly heavy. Vindictiveness and lying are always wicked, but when a man directs them against one from whose hands he has received the cup of life, they become a crime the effects of which are appalling. The fact that a man has a large amount of bad karma behind him makes anything like occult advancement impossible for him until it is worked off. For example, those who are deeply involved in karmic debts are not likely to be candidates for membership in the community of the sixth root race. No one could become an adept if he had evil karma behind him, because he must be free from any necessity for rebirth. A man who can function freely in his buddhic or rational vehicle, and so drop the causal body, need never again take up the ladder. But naturally this cannot be done until all the karma of the lower planes is exhausted. The master sends out all of his forces in open curves. But any lower thought of self causes the force sent out to travel in a closed curve, so that, whether it be good or bad, it has to return to its source and the man must come back to receive it. A man is not free from the binding results on lower planes until he is perfectly selfless on those planes. A man who when helping another feels perfectly the unity with him, obtains the result of his action on the rational plane only, and not lower down. Do not forget also that we are making karma on the astral plane, for a man can make karma wherever his consciousness is developed, or wherever he can act or choose. I have seen cases where actions done on the astral plane have borne karmic fruit in the next physical life. Another point to remember is that there is always a general karma belonging to an order or a nation, and that each individual in that order or that nation is, to a certain extent, responsible for the action of the whole. For instance, a priest has a certain responsibility for all that the collective priesthood does, even though he may not personally approve of it. Animal karma. Students often ask questions upon the working of karma in connection with the animal kingdom, saying that since it is scarcely conceivable that animals can have made much karma of any kind, it is difficult to account for the extreme differences to be observed in their conditions, one being well and kindly treated, while another is subjected to all kinds of brutalities, one always protected and well-fed, while another is left to starve and to fight for the bare right of living. There are 2 points to be borne in mind in this connection. First, an animal often does make a good deal of karma. Second, the well-treated animal has not always so much advantage as he appears to have, for association with man does not always improve the animal or tend to evolve it in the right direction. The sporting dog is taught by the hunter to be far more savage and brutal than it could ever become in any form of life that could come to it by nature. For the wild animal kills only to satisfy his hunger, and it is only man who introduces into animal life the wickedness of killing for the sake of the lust of destruction. However much his intelligence may be developed, it would have been far better for this unfortunate creature if he had never come into contact with humanity. For through him his group soul has now made karma, karma of the most evil kind, for which other dogs which are expressions of that group soul will have to suffer later in order that gradually the savagery may be weeded out. The same may be said of the lapdog who is pampered by some foolish mistress so that he gradually loses all the canine virtues, and becomes an embodiment of selfishness and love of ease. In both these cases man is criminally abusing his trust with regard to the animal kingdom, and is deliberately developing the lower instead of the higher instincts in the creatures committed to his care, thereby making bad karma himself, and leading a group soul to make bad karma also. Man's duty towards the dog is clearly to evolve in him devotion, affection, intelligence, and usefulness, and to repress kindly but firmly every manifestation of the savage and cruel side of his nature, which a brutalized humanity has for ages so sedulously fostered. Questioners sometimes speak as though they thought that a dog or a cat receives a certain incarnation as a reward of merit. We are not as yet dealing with a separated individuality, and therefore there is for that particular animal no past in which individual karma in the ordinary sense of the word can have been generated, nothing either to merit or to receive a reward. When a particular block of that monadic essence which is evolving along the line of animal incarnation which culminates in, let us say, the dog, has reached a fairly high level, the separate animals which form its manifestation down here are brought into contact with man, in order that its evolution may receive the stimulus which that contact alone can supply. The block of essence ensouling that group of dogs has in the matter so much of karma as is involved in having so governed its manifold expressions that it has been able to reach the level where such association is possible. And each dog belonging to that group soul has his share of the result. So that when people ask what an individual dog can have done to merit a life of ease or the reverse, they are allowing themselves to be deceived by the illusion of mere outward appearance. And forgetting that there is no such thing as an individual dog, except during the latter part of that final incarnation in which the definite breaking away of a fresh soul from the block has occurred. Some of our friends do not realize that there may be such a thing as the commencement of an entirely new piece of karma. When an injury is done by A to B, they always fall back on the theory that at some previous time B must have injured A, and is now imply reaping what he has sown. That may be so in many cases, but such a chain of causation must begin somewhere, and it is quite as likely that this may be a spontaneous act of injustice on A's part, for which karma will assuredly have to repay him in the future. While B's suffering, though undeserved as far as A is concerned, is the payment for some other act or acts which he has committed in the past in connection with someone else. In the case of the ill treatment of an animal by a man, this is certain, that it cannot be the result of previous karma on the part of the particular animal. Because if it were an individual capable of carrying over karma, it would not have been again incarnated in animal form. But the group soul of which it is a part must have acquired karma, or the thing could not happen. Animals do often intentionally cause each other terrible suffering. It is reasonably certain from various considerations that the prey killed by a wild beast for food, in what may be called the natural necessary course of business, does not suffer appreciably. But in the unnecessary and intentional fights which so often occur between animals, bulls, stags, dogs or cats, for example, great pain is willfully inflicted, and that means bad karma for the group soul. Karma that must in the future be paid by it through some of its manifestations. Not for one moment, however, not by one tittle, does that lessen the guilt of the human beast who treats the animal cruelly, or causes him to fight or inflict pain on other creatures. Most emphatically there is karma, an exceedingly heavy karma, stored up for himself by the man who thus abuses the power to help which has been placed in his hands. And in many and many a life to come he will suffer the just result of his abominable brutality. If one takes the trouble necessary to obtain a complete grasp of such knowledge as is already available in theosophical literature on the subjects of karma and of animal reincarnation, the main principles upon which their laws work will be found clear and readily comprehensible. I fully recognize how small and general such knowledge is, and I realize that many cases are constantly occurring in which the details of the method in which the karma works itself out are entirely beyond our ken. But you may see enough to show you that what we have been taught as to the inevitability and the absolute justice of the great law is one of the fundamental truths of nature. Secure in that certainty, you can afford to wait for the more detailed comprehension until you gain those higher faculties which alone will give the power to see the working of the system as a whole. Assuredly, as we progress, the divine light will illumine for us many corners that as yet remain in shadow, and we shall gradually but surely grow towards a perfect knowledge of the divine truth which even now is enfolding us, guarding and guiding us. All those who have had the privilege of studying these subjects under the guidance and with the help of the great masters of the wisdom are so fully persuaded of this that even where at present they do not see fully, they are more than willing and ready to trust to that great power of which as yet only dim glimpses can be vouchsafed to human eye. Ninth section, the Theosophical Society and its founders. What is the Theosophical Society? It would appear that some of its members have not quite comprehended the position of this Theosophical Society to which they belong. It is not a society which is formed merely for the promotion of learning in some special branch, like the Royal Asiatic or the Royal Geographical Societies, still less is it a church, which exists only to spread some particular form of doctrine. It has a place in modern life which is all its own, for its origin is unlike that of any other body at present existing. To understand this origin we must glance for a moment at the hidden side of the history of the world. All students of occultism are aware that the evolution of the world is not being left to run its course haphazard, but that its direction and administration are in the hands of a great hierarchy of adepts, sometimes called the White Brotherhood. To that brotherhood belong those whom we name the Masters, because they are willing under certain conditions to accept as pupils those who prove themselves worthy of the honor. But not all adepts are masters, not all will take such pupils. Many of them, though equal in occult rank, have the whole of their time occupied in quite other ways, though always for the helping of evolution. For the better surveillance and management of the field of action, they have mapped out the world into districts, much as the Church divides its territory into parishes, though these are parishes of continental size. And an adept presides over each of these districts just as a priest does over his parish. But sometimes the Church makes a special effort, not connected specially with any one of its parishes, but intended for the good of all. It sends forth what is called a home mission, with the object of stirring up faith and arousing enthusiasm all over a country, the benefits obtained being in no way a matter of personal gain to the missioners, but going to increase the efficiency of the ordinary parishes. In a certain way the Theosophical Society corresponds to such a mission, the ordinary religious divisions of the world being the parishes. For this society comes forth among them all, not seeking to take away from any one of them those people who are following it, but striving to make them understand it and live it better than they ever did before. And in many cases giving back to them on a higher and more intelligent level the faith in it which they had previously all but lost. Yes, and other men too, who had nominally no religion, who, though at heart of the religious type, have yet been unable to accept the crudities of orthodox teaching, have found in Theosophy a presentation of the truth to which, because of its inherent reasonableness and wide tolerance, they are able heartily to subscribe. We have among our members Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, Parsis, Jews, Mohammedans and Christians, and no one of them all has ever heard or read from any of the officials of our society a word against the religion to which he belongs. Indeed, in many cases the work of the society has produced a distinct revival of religious interest in places where it has been established. Why this should be so is readily comprehensible when we remember that it is from this same great brotherhood that all the religions of the world have their origin. In this true though hidden government of the world there is a department of religious instruction, and the head of that department has founded all the different religions either personally or through some pupil, suiting the teaching given in each case to the people for whom it was destined, and to the period in the world's history which had then been reached. They are simply different presentations of the same teaching, as may at once be seen by comparing them. The external forms vary considerably, but the broad essentials are always the same. By all the same virtues are commended. By all the same vices are condemned, so that the daily life of a good Buddhist or a good Hindu is practically identical with that of a good Christian or a good Mohammedan. They do the same things, but they call them by different names. One spends much time in prayer, and the other in meditation, but really their exercises are the same, and they all agree that the good man must be just, kindly, generous and true. It is said that some hundreds of years ago the leading officials of the Brotherhood decided that once in every 100 years, in what to us is the last quarter of each century, a special effort should be made to help the world in some way. Some of these attempts can be readily discerned, such, for example, as the movement initiated by Christian Rosenkreutz in the 14th century, simultaneously with the great reforms in Northern Buddhism introduced by Tsongkhapa. The remarkable renaissance of classical learning and the introduction of printing into Europe in the 15th. The work of Akbar in India in the 16th, at the same time with the publication of many works in England and elsewhere by Lord Bacon, and the splendid development of the Elizabethan age. The founding of the Royal Society, and the scientific work of Robert Boyle and others after the Restoration in the 17th. The activities in the 18th, the secret history of which on higher planes is known to but few, which escaped from control and degenerated into the French Revolution, and in the 19th the foundation of the Theosophical Society. This society is one of the great world movements, destined to produce effects far greater than any that we have yet seen. The history of its work so far is but a prologue to that which is to come, and its importance is out of all proportion to what it has hitherto appeared to be. It has this difference from all movements that have preceded it, that it is first, the herald of the coming Christ, and secondly, the first definite step towards the founding of a new root race. Many of our students are aware that the Master M. the great adept to whom both of our founders owe special allegiance, has been selected to be the Manu of that race, and that his inseparable friend the Master K.H. is to be in charge of its religious teaching. It is evident that in the work which these two great ones will have to do they will need an army of devoted subordinates, who must above all things be loyal, obedient and painstaking. They may possess other qualities also, but these at least they must have. There will be scope for the keenest intelligence, the greatest ingenuity and ability in every direction. But all these will be useless without the capacity of instant obedience and utter trust in the Master. Self-conceit is an absolute bar to progress in this direction. The man who can never obey an order because he always thinks he knows better than the authorities, the man who cannot sink his personality entirely in the work which is given him to do, and cooperate harmoniously with his fellow workers, such a man has no place in the army of the Manu. Those who join it will have to incarnate over and over again in rapid succession in the new race, trying each time to bring their various bodies nearer and nearer to the model set before them by the Manu, a very laborious and trying piece of work, but one that is absolutely necessary for the establishment of the new type of humanity which is required for the race. The opportunity of volunteering for this work is now open to us. Those who wish to join in it must begin to differentiate their aims from those of the ordinary man of the world. If we are to be selected for that work, we must show ourselves ready and willing by doing this which is now offered to us. The great head of the Department of Religious Instruction, the Lord Maitreya, who has already spoken as Krishna to the Indians and as Christ to the Christians, has decided soon to pay another visit to the world for the healing and the helping of the nations, and for the revival of spirituality on the earth which has well nigh lost it. One great work which the Theosophical Society has to do is to try to prepare men for his coming, so that more may be able to profit by the unequaled opportunity which his presence will give. The religion which he founded when he came down in Judea 2000 years ago has now spread widely over the world. But when, after he left his physical body, his followers gathered together to discuss the situation, we are told that the number of the names was only 120. A single preacher was his herald then. Now it is a worldwide society of 20,000 members. May we hope to do a little better this time, to keep him with us longer than 3 years before the wickedness of the world drives him away, to draw around him a somewhat larger body of followers before he leaves us. That is yet to be seen. But it depends largely upon the energy, effort and selflessness of members of the Theosophical Society now. Besides its primary object of spreading occult truth throughout the world, the Theosophical Society has also this secondary object, that it may act as a kind of net to draw together out of all the world the people who are sufficiently interested in occultism to be willing to work for it. Out of that number a certain proportion will be found who desire to press on further, to learn all that the society has to teach, and to make real progress. Probably not all of those will succeed, but some certainly will, as some have done in the past. And from those who thus obtain a footing the adepts themselves may choose those whom they consider worthy of the great privilege of working under them in the future. Such selection cannot of course be guaranteed to anyone who passes even into the innermost groups of the society, since the choice is absolutely in the hands of the masters. We can say only that such selections have been made in the past, and that we know that many more volunteers are required. Many have joined the society without knowing anything of the inner opportunities which it offers, or the close relation with the great masters of wisdom into which it may bring its members. Many have come into it almost carelessly, with but little thought or comprehension of the importance of the step which they have taken, and there have been those who have left it equally carelessly, just because they have not fully understood. Even those have gained something, though far less than they might have gained if they had had greater intelligence. The Countess Wachtmeister tells how once when some casual visitors called to see Madame Blavatsky and offered to join the society, she immediately sent for the necessary forms and admitted them. After they had gone, the Countess seems to have said half remonstratingly that not much could be expected from them, for even she could see that they were joining only from motives of curiosity or courtesy. "That is true," said Madame Blavatsky, "but even this formal act has given them a small karmic link with the society, and that, little as it is, will mean at least something for them in the future. Some have committed the incredible folly of leaving it because they disapproved of the policy of its president, not reflecting first of all, that that policy is the president's business and not theirs. Secondly, that as the president knows enormously more in every direction than they do, there is probably for that policy some exceedingly good reason of which they are entirely unaware. And thirdly, that presidents and policies are after all temporary, and do not on any way affect the great fundamental fact that the society belongs to the masters and represents them, and that to abandon it is to desert their standard. Since they stand behind it, and intend to use it as an instrument, we may be sure that they will permit no serious error. It is surely not the part of a good soldier to desert from the ranks because he disapproves of the plans of the general, and to go off and fight single-handed. Nor is such fighting likely to be specially efficient or useful to the cause which he professes to champion. Some have deserted simply from a fear that if they remained in the society they might be identified with some idea of which they disapprove. This is not only selfishness but self-conceit. What does it matter what is thought or said of any of us, so long as the master's work is done and the master's plan carried out? We must learn to forget ourselves and think only of that work. It is true that that work will be done in any case, and that the place of those who refuse to do it will quickly be supplied. So it may be asked, what do defections matter? They do not matter to the work, but they matter very much to the deserter, who has thrown away an opportunity which may not recur for many incarnations. Such action shows a lack of all sense of proportion, an utter ignorance of what the society really is and of the inner side of its work. This work which our masters are doing, this work of the evolution of humanity, is the most fascinating thing in the whole world. Sometimes those of us who have been able to develop the faculties of the higher planes have been allowed a glimpse of that mighty scheme, have witnessed the lifting of a tiny corner of the veil. I know of nothing more stirring, more absorbingly interesting. The splendor, the colossal magnitude of the plans take away one's breath, yet even more impressive is the calm dignity, the utter certainty of it all. Not individuals only, but nations, are the pieces in this game, but neither nation nor individual is compelled to play any given part. The opportunity to play that part is given to it or to him. If he or it will not take it, there is invariably an understudy ready to step in and fill the gap. At this present time a magnificent opportunity is being offered to the great Anglo-Saxon race, to the whole Teutonic subrace, if it will only sink its petty rivalries and jealousies and take it. I hope with all my heart that it will do so. I believe that it will, but this I know, that if unfortunately it should fail, there is another nation already chosen to assume the scepter which in that case would fall from its hands. Such failure would cause a slight delay, while the new nation was being pushed rapidly forward to the necessary level, but at the end of a few centuries exactly the same result would have been achieved. That is the one thing that is utterly certain, that the intended end will be achieved, through whose agency this will be done matters very much to the agent, but nothing at all to the total progress of the world. Let us throw ourselves into that work, not out of it, trying ever to do more and more of it, and to do it better and better. For if we do well now in comparatively small matters, in lodge activities, in propaganda work, in the service of those around us, we may be permitted to do something much grander, to help to smooth the way for the coming of the Lord. If we have the glorious privilege of earnestly and humbly making ourselves useful then, we may presently be entrusted with even greater responsibilities in connection with that new root race, and of us will be true what was said of old, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Thou hast been faithful over a few things, I will make thee ruler over many things, enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. Theosophy and World Leaders. A thoughtful theosophist cannot but wonder sometimes how it is that theosophy, though unquestionably representing the most advanced theory of existence and the most complete statement of the highest wisdom at present available, yet does not seem to appeal at all to many of the most eminent leaders of the world's thought and progress, whether it be along the lines of science, art, literature, philosophy, or religion. These men of the keenest intellect, these others of the noblest spirituality, surely they ought to be the very first to welcome the splendid effulgence of theosophy, the clarity and common sense of its system, the light which it throws upon all the problems of life and death, the beauty of the ideals which it puts before us. But the fact remains that they do not welcome it, but on the contrary many of them treat it with indifference, or even contempt. Their attitude is a remarkable phenomenon. How can we explain it? Again, as to ourselves, putting aside such an altogether abnormal person as our president, we know quite well that we who are theosophists are in intellect far behind the great leaders of scientific and philosophical thought. Just as in spirituality and devotion we are far behind some of the great saints of whom we hear in the various religions. Yet we have the inestimable privilege of finding ourselves in a theosophical society. We can understand, believe and assimilate its teachings, while these others apparently cannot. We are clearly no better than they. Along certain lines we are obviously less developed. Why should this great and glorious reward come to us and not to them? It is a great and glorious reward, let us make no mistake as to that. The strongest adjectives in the language, the most poetical description that we can conceive, would fail adequately to convey what theosophy is to those who can grasp it, what it does for those who put it into practice. Since it does all this for us who are commonplace folk, why does it leave these much higher and grander people cold and unmoved? They are higher and grander. Here is another point about which no mistake must be made. The intellect of the great scientific man is a very wonderful and wholly desirably thing, the culmination of ages of development. The spirituality, the utter unworldliness and the deep devotion of the saint are beautiful and precious beyond all words, and such saintship comes only as the crown of many lives of earnest effort along that special line. These are indeed gifts which none can despise or gainsay. More to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. Yet their possessors have not the inestimable pearl of theosophy, and we have it, we who stand on the plain, and look up to them on the mountain heights. Clearly these great men have much that we have not, much at least that in us is as yet merely rudimentary. What have we that they have not, that we are worthy of so great an honor? This is what we have, the knowledge of the direction in which to put forth our forces. We have it because from the theosophical teaching we understand something of the scheme of things, something of the plan upon which the world is built, something of the object and method of evolution, and that not only in a broad and general sense, but also in sufficient detail to make it practically applicable to the life of the individual. But why is all this so much clearer to us, the small people, than to these greater ones? By our own doctrine we know how utter true the faultless balance weighs, how none can have even the smallest benefit to which he is not entitled. What have we done to merit this greatest of all rewards, we who are very much like thousands of other people, full of ordinary human faults, neither better nor worse than the great majority of our fellow men? Whatever it is that we have done, it must evidently have been in some other life than this. Many of us can bear testimony that when we first met with theosophy, this time, something within us leapt up at once in glad response to its appeal, in eager recognition of kinship to its thought. Yet we all know that there are many other better people than we in whom it evokes no response whatever, who cannot understand the depth of our enthusiasm for it. We usually, and quite correctly, explain this by saying that we have met with these glorious truths before, that we have known of and studied these things in a former life, and that our unappreciative friends have not. But that does not solve the problem, it only moves it a stage further back. Why, in that former life did we study these things, while our more gifted friends did not? The answer is that the world is still at an early stage of its evolution, and that man has not yet had time to unfold all qualities. He must take them in some sort of order, he must begin somewhere. And men differ because they have chosen different points from which to begin. We have our qualities and our powers, such as they are, and our attraction to these subjects, because it is in that direction that we have been putting out our every effort in the faraway past. No one possesses any quality that he has not worked to unfold within himself. So if our greater friends are gifted in certain ways, it is because they have earned their gift by hard work in previous lives. Just as by study in another life we have acquired our gift, the power to understand and appreciate something of theosophical truth, so have they acquired their shining powers of intellect or devotion by practicing these qualities long ago. We have taken different lines then, we have spent our time in developing different qualities. Now we each have what we have earned, but naturally each finds himself without those other qualities at which he has not been specially working. We are all imperfect, but not all imperfect in the same direction. Manifestly we must aim in the future at an all-round development, so that each must acquire the qualities which others now possess, but he as yet does not. Another very interesting point, which has been somewhere well put by our President, is that the great leaders of thought at the present day are fulfilling a certain function in the world's evolution which they could not so well fill if they knew all that we know. This is the fifth subrace of the fifth root race, and the fullest possible unfoldment of the lower mind is the task at the moment set before humanity. These leaders who intensity it, glory in it, almost worship it, are doing the work which they are appointed to do for the majority of mankind. It is precisely because they believe in intellect so thoroughly, because they think that there is nothing beyond it, that they can so intensify it and carry it to so high a place. It is because they know just so much, and no more, that they are convenient pawns to be used in this particular part of the cosmic game. For, as Omar Khayyam says, we are but pieces in the game he plays. Upon this checkerboard of nights and days, hither and thither moves, and checks, and slays. And one by one back in the closet lays. These great men are the appointed leaders of a certain stage, and they are doing their work nobly. We cannot expect them to turn aside from that now to listen to us and our message. There will come a time in the future when they will listen, and then the magnificent intellectual development which they are now acquiring will carry them far and rapidly along the road of occult progress. These three things it is clear that man must have before he can hope to reach perfection: intellect, spirituality, and discrimination, which last quality may in this case be defined as the knowledge of how to use the other two wisely. If any one of these be absent, the working of the others cannot but be to some extent defective. We constantly see that this is so. The scientific man evolves intellect to a very high level, but if the spiritual side of his nature is entirely undeveloped, he may use intellect for personal ends instead of for the good of all. Or he may be unscrupulous in the pursuit of knowledge, as is the vivisector. The saint reaches a high level of devotion and spirituality, yet for lack of intellect he may often make himself ridiculous by superstition, he may be narrow-minded, and even a persecutor. And both the saint and the scientist may waste their energies in quite wrong direction for want of a clear knowledge of the great plan of the Logos, the very thing that Theosophy gives. What a man is now is the consequence of what he has done and thought in the past. If he has devoted his energy to the development of intellect, well and good, he has the intellect for which he has worked. But, since in addition to that he needs spirituality and discrimination, he must now devote himself to working for the acquisition of those faculties. If he has so far spent his time chiefly in devotion, he has gained great power in that direction, but he must now proceed to unfold those other qualities of intellect and discrimination to which he has not yet turned his attention. If in previous lives he has studied the great scheme of things, he comes back this time with power to comprehend and the intuition to accept the truth, and that is indeed well for him. But he still needs to unfold from within himself the qualities to which the other men have been devoting themselves. Unfortunately, man at these early stages of evolution is so constituted that he is apt to boast of what he himself possesses, and to try to exalt his own qualities by minimizing those of others instead of imitating what is best in them. So it happens that the saint and the man of science rarely appreciate one another, and not infrequently there is a good deal of mutual contempt and misunderstanding. It is for us to be careful that we do not allow ourselves to fall into the same snare. Let us remember that we set before ourselves as a goal the attainment of adeptship, and that the adept is the perfect man in whom all these different good qualities exist in the highest degree. Before we reach adeptship we have to develop as much spirituality as the greatest of the saints, and far more, as much intellect as the most brilliant man of science, and far more. So our attitude towards those who already possess these most desirable attributes should be not carping criticism, but the most generous appreciation and admiration of all that is good. While our own quality, that of knowledge of the direction in which evolution is moving, will prevent us from imitating the mistakes in addition to the excellencies of those who, while far advanced along other lines, are as yet scarcely even on the threshold or ours. All these qualities are necessary, and we have much hard work before us to develop those in which we are at present lacking. Yet I think we may congratulate ourselves upon the choice which we made in other lives, when we devoted ourselves to the study of the great scheme as a whole, to the endeavor to understand the plan of the Logos, and in our humble way to cooperate with him. For that has brought us, or should have brought us, contentment with our lot, the power to make the best of everything, and to see the best in everything. Most men are eager to see the worst in everybody, to pounce upon flaws in everything, to find something at which to carp and cavil. We who are theosophists should cultivate a spirit exactly the reverse of this. We should see the hidden deity in every one and everything, and our eagerness should ever be to discover in all of them not what is evil, but what is good. If these others despise us, if the scientific man ridicules us as superstitious and refuses to listen to our explanations, if the devotional person regards us with horror as unorthodox, and insists on clinging to a less noble presentation of his deity than that which we offer him, let us on our side take heed that we do not make a corresponding mistake. They have their weak points, no doubt, and one of them is this prejudice which renders them unable to appreciate the truth. Let us be courteous enough gracefully to ignore such failings, and focus our attention upon the splendid qualities in which they really excel, those qualities in which we must use our most strenuous endeavor to imitate them. For since we see that the Logos wills to use in his service our intellect and our devotion, we have the strongest conceivable motive to develop them as rapidly as we can, and we shall be saved much trouble, much mortification and waste of energy by the knowledge which we already have of the direction in which he wills that these forces should be employed. All that we have is from him, and therefore all that we have we hold on his behalf and at his disposal, to be used ever and only in his service. Reminiscences. I first heard of Theosophy through coming across a second-hand copy of Mr. Sinnett's book The Occult World, but my first communication from one of the masters was obtained in a somewhat unusual way. For some years before this I had been engaged in the investigation of spiritualism, and in the course of that inquiry I had come into contact with most of the prominent mediums of that day, and had seen every one of the ordinary phenomena about which one reads in books upon that subject. One medium with when I had much to do was Mr. Eglinton, and although I have heard stories told against him, I must bear witness that in all my own dealings with him I found him most straightforward, reasonable and courteous. One of his specialties was slate writing, and I found it a very useful phenomenon to show to any inquirer who adopted the skeptical attitude. The method was this. On the way to the séance I took the skeptic into a stationer's shop and induced him to buy 2 new school slates, and to have them packed in one parcel with a tiny crumb of slate pencil enclosed between them. I advised him to assure himself that the parcel was securely tied, and to seal the knots with his own seal if he had one. Then I told him to carry the parcel, and on no account whatever to let it pass out of his personal custody either before or during the séance. If during the performance it was necessary to sit with joined hands, I advised him to sit upon his parcel. Thus the séance commenced, and usually after a very short time there would be raps or some other indication that the force had gathered. We sat usually at a small square wooden table without any cloth upon it, and Eglinton's plan was to take an ordinary slate, lay upon it a crumb of pencil and then slip it under the table, holding the slate against the under surface of the table. As this was in broad daylight, and we were alone in the room with the medium, there was no opportunity for substitution of previously prepared slates or anything of that sort. The slate being held in this way, writing would appear on the surface which was pressed close against the table, writing in answer to any question which we chose to ask. After this had been going on for some little time, I asked insinuatingly whether the kind spirits could write on our slates. Nearly always the answer was in the affirmative, though once or twice I have been told that the power was not strong enough. Then I turned to the skeptic and asked him to produce his sealed package of slates, but on no account to allow it to go out of his hands. Usually he held it out in both his hands above the table, and Mr. Eglinton would place one hand lightly upon the package. Under those conditions I asked the skeptic to formulate a mental question, and then while he still held the package of slates we heard the writing rapidly going on inside. When the usual 3 little taps announced that the message was finished, I said to the skeptic, "Now examine your slates and your string, and make sure that no one has thrown you into an hypnotic trance and tampered with your parcel. Then cut it open and read your answer." Generally we found the 2 sides of the slates which had been pressed together filled with writing more or less in relation to the mental question which had been formulated. Usually the skeptic was tremendously impressed and even dumbfounded for the time, but within a week he generally wrote to say that of course we had somehow or other been deceived, and we had not really seen what we thought we saw. Mr. Eglinton had various so-called controls, one a Red Indian girl who called herself Daisy, and chattered volubly whether opportunity offered or not. Another was a tall Arab, named Abdullah, considerably over 6 feet, who never said anything, but produced remarkable phenomena, and often exhibited feats showing great strength. I have seen him simultaneously lift 2 heavy men, one in each hand. A third control who frequently put in an appearance was Ernest. He comparatively rarely materialized, but frequently spoke with direct voice, and wrote a characteristic and well-educated hand. One day in conversation with him something was said in reference to the masters of the wisdom. Ernest spoke of them with the most profound reverence, and said that he had on various occasions had the privilege of seeing them. I at once inquired whether he was prepared to take charge of any message or letter for them, and he said that he would willingly do so, and would deliver it when opportunity offered, but he could not say exactly when that would be. I may mention here that in connection with this I had later a good example of the unreliability of all such communications. Some considerable time afterwards some spiritualist wrote to light explaining that there could not possibly be such persons as the masters, because Ernest had positively told him that there were not. I wrote to the same newspaper to say that I had it on precisely the same valueless authority that there were masters, and that Ernest knew them well. In each case Ernest had evidently reflected the thought of the questioner, as such entities so often do. To return to my story, I at once provisionally accepted Ernest's offer. I said that I would write a letter to one of these great masters, and would confide it to him if my friend and teacher, Mr. Sinnett, approved. At the mention of this name the spirits were much perturbed. Daisy especially was very angry, and declared that she would have nothing to do with Mr. Sinnett under any circumstances. "Why, he calls us spooks," she said, with great indignation. However, I blandly stuck to my point that all I knew of theosophy had come to me through Mr. Sinnett, and that I therefore did not feel justified in going behind his back in any way, or trying to find some other means of communication without first consulting him. Finally, though with a very bad grace, the spirits consented to this, and the séance presently terminated. When Mr. Eglinton came out of his trance, I asked him how I could send a letter to Ernest, and he said at once that if I would send the letter to him he would put it in a certain box which hung against the wall, from which Ernest would take it when he wished. I then posted off to Mr. Sinnett, and asked his opinion of all this. He was at once eagerly interested, and advised me promptly to accept the offer and see what happened. Thereupon I went home and wrote 3 letters. The first was to the Master K.H., telling him with all reverence that ever since I had first heard of theosophy my one desire had been to place myself under him as a pupil. I told him of my circumstances at the time, and asked whether it was necessary that the 7 years of probation of which I had heard should be passed in India. I put this letter in a small envelope and sealed it carefully with my own seal. Then I enclosed it in a letter to Ernest in which I reminded him of his promise, and asked him to deliver this letter for me, and to bring back an answer, if there should be one. That second letter I sealed in the same manner as the first, and then I enclosed that in turn with a short note to Eglinton, asking him to put it in his box and let me know whether any notice was taken of it. I had asked a friend who was staying with me to examine the seals of both the letters with a microscope, so that if we should see them again we might know whether anyone had been tampering with them. By return of post I received a note from Mr. Eglinton, saying that he had duly put the note for Ernest into his box, and that it had already vanished, and further that if any reply should come to him he would at once forward it. A few days later I received a letter directed in a hand which was unknown to me, and on opening it I discovered my own letter to Ernest apparently unopened, the name Ernest on the envelope being marked out, and my own written underneath it in pencil. My friend and I once more examined the seal with a microscope, and were unable to detect any indication whatever that anyone had tampered with the letter, and we both agreed that it was quite impossible that it could have been opened. Yet on cutting it open I discovered that the letter which I had written to the master had disappeared. All that I found inside was my own letter to Ernest, with a few words in the well-known handwriting of the latter written on its blank page, to the effect that my letter had been duly handed to the great master, and that if in the future I should ever be thought worthy to receive an answer Ernest would gladly bring it to me. I waited for some months, but no reply came, and whenever I went to Eglinton's séances and happened to encounter Ernest I always asked him when I might expect my answer. He invariably said that my letter had been duly delivered, but that nothing had yet been said about an answer, and that he could do no more. 6 months later I did receive a reply, but not through Ernest, and in it the master said that though he had not received the letter, nor, as he remarked, was it likely that he should, considering the nature of the messenger, he was aware of what I had written and he now proceeded to answer it. He told me that the 7 years of probation could be passed anywhere, but he suggested that I might come out here for a few months, to see whether I could work with the headquarters staff. I wish to say in answer to this that my circumstances were such that it would be impossible for me to come to Udyar for 3 months, and then return to the work in which I was then engaged. But that I was perfectly ready to throw up that work altogether and to devote my life absolutely to his service. Ernest having so conspicuously failed me, I knew of no way to get this message to the master but to take it to Madame Blavatsky, and as she was to leave England on the following day for India, I rushed up to London to see her. It was with difficulty that I induced her to read the letter, as she said very decidedly that such communications were intended only for the recipient. I was obliged to insist, however, and at last she read it and asked me what I wished to say in reply. I answered to the above effect, and asked her how this information could be conveyed to the master. She replied that he knew it already, referring of course to the exceedingly close relation in which she stood with him, so that whatever was within her consciousness was also within his when he wished it. She then told me to wait by her, and not to leave her on any account. I waited patiently all through the afternoon and evening, and even went with her quite late at night to Mrs. Oakley's house, where a number of friends were gathered to say farewell. Madame Blavatsky sat in an easy chair by the fireside, talking brilliantly to those who were present, and rolling one of her eternal cigarettes, when suddenly her right hand was jerked out towards the fire in a very peculiar fashion, and lay palm upwards. She looked down at it in surprise, as I did myself, for I was standing close to her, leaning with an elbow on the mantelpiece. And several of us saw quite clearly a sort of whitish mist form in the palm of her hand and then condense into a piece of folded paper, which she at once handed to me, saying, "There is your answer." Every one in the room crowded round, of course, but she sent me away outside to read it, saying that I must not let anyone see its contents. It told me that my intuition of throwing up everything and coming out here was a right one. That was what he had wished me to do, but could not ask it unless I offered. I was further told to take a steamer a few days later and to join Madame Blavatsky in Egypt, which of course I did. In Cairo we took up our quarters in the Hotel d'Orient. Here it was that I first saw one of the members of the Brotherhood. While sitting on the floor at Madame Blavatsky's feet, sorting out some papers for her, I was startled to see standing between us a man who had not entered by the door. It was he who is now the Master D.K. Though at that date he had not taken the degree which made him an adept. Our stay in Egypt with Madame Blavatsky was in many ways a most remarkable experience, as she constantly told us much of the inner side of what we saw there. She had been in Egypt before, and was well acquainted with some of the officials, with the Prime Minister, Nubar Pasha, with the Russian consul Monsieur Hitrovo, and especially with the curator of the museum, Monsieur Maspero. I remember particularly how we went through the museum with this last gentleman, and how Madame Blavatsky was able to give him a great mass of most interesting information about the various curiosities which were under his care. Madame Blavatsky understood Arabic, and she used to amuse us greatly by translating for our benefit the private remarks which were being made by the grave and dignified Arab merchants, as they sat talking to one another in the bazaar. After they had for some time been calling us Christian dogs, and speaking disrespectfully of our female relatives for many generations, she blandly asked them in their own language whether they thought that this was the way in which a good son of the Prophet should speak of those from whom he hoped to gain much in the way of business. The men were always covered with confusion, not having expected that any European could possibly understand them. Arabic, however, seems to have been the only Oriental language with which she was acquainted. She did not know Sanskrit, and many of the difficulties of our theosophical terminology arise from the fact that in those days she would describe what she saw or knew, and then ask any Indian who happened to be near what was the Sanskrit name for it. Very often the gentleman who provided her with the term had not clearly understood what she meant. And even when he did, we must remember that she asked adherents of different schools of philosophy, and that each answered according to the shade of meaning applied to the term in his teaching. Many curious phenomena were constantly taking place around her at this period. First, she was herself the most striking of all the phenomena, for her changes were protean. Sometimes the masters themselves used her body, and wrote or spoke directly through her. At other times when her ego was elsewhere engaged, one or other of two pupils of lower degree than herself would take the body, and there were even certain occasions when another woman used to be in charge. I have myself frequently seen all these changes take place, and I have seen the new man who had entered the body looking round to discover the condition of affairs into which he had come, trying to take up the thread of conversation, for example. Yet with all this, she was in no sense of the word like an ordinary medium, for the true owner of the body stood at the back all the time in full consciousness, and thoroughly understood what was going on. Extraordinary phenomena, however, also occasionally occurred. While we were crossing the desert by train from Ismailia to Cairo, a letter fell in the railway carriage, referring to the subject matter of the conversation then proceeding, and conveying by name to each one present a kindly message of encouragement. I and another member of the party happened to be looking up at the time when this letter came, and we both saw it appear in the air, just in the circular space in the roof of the carriage in which a lamp is usually put at night. It came, just as the other had done, as a vague ball of whitish mist which condensed into a piece of paper and fluttered down. I remember another occasion on which she bought in the Cent Bazaar at Cairo a tiny bottle of attar of roses, for use in the shrine room here, paying £2 for it. When we were sitting at lunch in the hotel half an hour afterwards, at a small table reserved for our party in an alcove, 2 English sovereigns fell out of space upon the table. And Madame Blavatsky explained that she had been told she ought not to spend money upon them in this way, as we should need every shilling that we had before we reached Udyar, a statement which certainly proved true. At one time and another I have seen a good many of the phenomena which were so closely associated with Madame Blavatsky. I have seen her precipitate drawing and writing, and I have also seen her find a missing object by occult power. On several occasions I have seen letters fall out of the air in her presence. And I must also state that I have seen such a letter fall here in this house at Udyar when she was 6,000 miles away in England. And again that I myself have several times had the privilege of being employed by the master to deliver just such letters after her departure from the physical plane. In those early days of the society messages and instructions from the masters were frequent, and we lived at a level of splendid enthusiasm which those who have joined since Madame Blavatsky's death can hardly imagine. Those of us who have had the inestimable privilege of direct touch with the masters have naturally retained that enthusiasm, but we have been unable under less favorable circumstances to keep it up among the rank and file of the members. Perhaps now we may be about to witness a recrudescence of it. May we all be worthy to take part in the glorious times that are coming. Faithful unto death. Long ago in old Atlantis, in the great city of the Golden Gate, there reigned a mighty king. One day there came to him a soldier whom he had sent out to head an expedition against a troublesome tribe on the borders of that vast empire. The soldier reported victory, and as a reward the king gave him the position of captain of the palace guard, and placed specially in his charge the life of his own only son, the heir apparent to his throne. Not long afterwards the newly appointed captain had an opportunity of proving his faithfulness to his trust. For when he was alone with the young prince in the palace gardens a band of conspirators rushed upon them and tried to assassinate his charge. The captain fought bravely against heavy odds and, though mortally wounded, succeeded in protecting the prince from serious harm until help arrived, and he and the unconscious prince were borne together into the presence of the king. The monarch heard the story and, turning to his dying captain, said, "What can I do for you who have given your life for me?" The captain replied, "Grant me to serve you and your son forever in future lives, since now there is the bond of blood between us." And with a last effort he dipped his finger in the blood which flowed so fast from his wounds, and touched with it the feet of his sovereign and the forehead of the still unconscious prince. The king held out his hand in benediction, and replied, "By the blood that has been shed for me and mine, I promise that both you and he shall serve me to the end." So was the first link forged between three leaders of men of whom we have all heard, for that great king is now the Master M. The prince his son has been known to us as Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, and the captain of the guard as Henry Steele Olcott. Through all the ages since, through many strange vicissitudes, the link has been kept unbroken and the service has been rendered, as we know that it will be through ages yet to come. Since then as Gashtasp, king of Persia, he protected and assisted in the foundation of the present form of Zoroastrianism. And later as the world-renowned King Asoka he issued those wonderful edicts which remain until this day graven upon rocks and pillars in India to show how real were his zeal and his devotion. And when, at the end of that long and strenuous life, he looked back upon it with sorrow to see how far short of his intentions even his wonderful achievements had fallen, his master showed him, for his encouragement, two visions. One of the past and one of the future. The vision of the past was the scene in Atlantis when the link between them was forged. The vision of the future showed his master as the Manu of the sixth root race and our president-founder as a lieutenant serving under him in the exalted work of that high office. So Asoka died content in the certainty that the closest of all earthly ties, that between the master and his pupil, would never be severed. Having thus taken a prominent part in the spreading of two of the great religions of the world, Zoroastrianism and Buddhism, it was appropriate that he should be so closely associated with the work of this great movement which synthesizes all religions, the Theosophical Society. Never himself the spiritual teacher, he has always been the practical organizer who made the teacher's work possible. In his recent life as in all those others, his ruling principle was always that of passionate loyalty to the master and to the work which he had to do. When first I met him more than a quarter of a century ago that was the dominant feature in his character, through all the years that I have known him that above all other motives ruled his actions. It inspires the last letter which I received from him, written only a few weeks before his death. It has been still his most salient characteristic in the astral world in which he has since been living. If we turn to the outward details of this last life of his, we still find the same keynote of devotion to duty. The Assistant Secretary of the United States Treasury wrote to him with regard to his public work for the government. "I wish to say that I have never met with a gentleman entrusted with important duties, of more capacity, rapidity and reliability than have been exhibited by you throughout. More than all, I desire to bear testimony to your entire uprightness and integrity of character, which I am sure have characterized your whole career, and which to my knowledge have never been assailed. That you have thus escaped with no stain upon your reputation, when we consider the corruption, audacity, and power of the many villains in high position whom you have prosecuted and punished, is a tribute of which you may well be proud, and which no other man occupying a similar position and performing similar services in this country has ever achieved." He showed the same energy and capacity in his work for the Theosophical Society. Few of our members realized the extent and the success of his labors, for much of what he did can be properly appreciated only by those who have traveled in those eastern lands which he loved so well. To his untiring exertion was due the rebuilding and enlargement of the Society's headquarters at Udyar. It was he who founded the great library there. And on the occasion of its opening gathered together to bless its inception priests of all the leading religions of the world, the first occasion in history on which such representatives had met in fraternal accord. Each freely acknowledging the others as standing on an equal footing with himself. To him is due the great movement for Buddhist education in the island of Ceylon, in consequence of which up to the present, 287 Buddhist schools have been founded, in which over 35,000 children are being taught. He it was who brought together on a common platform of belief the northern and southern schools of Buddhism, separated for more than 1,000 years, he it was who took up the education of the neglected pariah class. Many and great were the difficulties in his way in holding together and directing so complex a movement as the Theosophical Society, yet in every land he was always popular, by every nation he was eagerly welcomed. His utter devotion to the welfare of the society and the transparent honesty of his purpose could not fail to impress all who met him. I speak of him with feeling, for I had special opportunities of knowing him well. I shall never forget his fatherly kindness to me, when as a comparatively young man, quite new to Indian life, I first went to reside at the headquarters at Udyar. Since then I have met him in many countries. I have passed weeks alone with him, except for an interpreter and a servant, in a bullock cart in the jungles of Ceylon. I went with him on the journey which carried Theosophy into Burma in 1885. Under circumstances like these one quickly gets to know a man with far greater intimacy than is afforded by years of ordinary social life. And I can unreservedly bear testimony to the whole-souled devotion of the man, to the fact that during all this time his one anxiety was the furthering of the theosophical work. His one thought how to please the Master by doing with all his might that which had been given him to do. His passing from among us is too recent for its details to have been forgotten. We all know how courageously he bore his sufferings, how all through his illness his constant thought was still the welfare of the dear society to which his life had been devoted. We remember how when the time came for him to leave the body 3 of the great masters stood beside him, as well as his old colleague and friend, H. P. Blavatsky. We have all read the magnificent speech of his successor at his cremation. That cremation was a grand and worthy ceremony. The pyre was of sandalwood and his body was covered with the American flag and the Buddhist flag, the latter a standard which he himself had invented, bearing in their right order the special colors of the aura of the Lord Buddha. He was unconscious for a while after death, but soon became fully awake and active. As I was always deeply attached to him, his master told me to act as a kind of guide to him when necessary, and to explain to him whatever he wished. He had always been keenly interested in the powers and possibilities of the astral plane, and as soon as he could see it clearly, he was full of eager and insatiable desire to know how everything is done, to understand the rationale of it, and to learn to do it himself. He has an unusually strong will in certain directions, and that made many of the experiments easy to him even when they were quite new. He is most at home in work which involves the use of power in some way, to fight, to cure, to defend. He is full of big schemes for the future, and is just as enthusiastic as ever about the society which he loves. His attention has been attracted by the strong thought about him involved in writing this. He stands beside me now, and insists that I shall convey to the members his most earnest advice to give wholehearted loyalty and support to his noble successor, to put aside at once and forever all pitiable squabbling over personalities, all unprofitable wrangling over matters which are not their business and which they cannot be expected to understand, and to turn their attention to the one and only matter of importance, the work which the society has to do in the world. His message to them is, forget yourselves, your limitations and your prejudices, and spread the truths of Theosophy. Of his future we can say little as yet. By the time that these lines are before the reader, it is probable that he will be again in incarnation. He has earnestly wished this, in order that he may work along with Madame Blavatsky in her present incarnation. How far his desire will be granted, I cannot yet tell. Certainly he will be employed wherever the masters think that he will be most useful. His great talent is organization, and we have seen that he has already practiced it in Zoroastrianism, in the great missionary enterprise of Buddhism and in the foundation of the Theosophical Society. No doubt he may have similar work to do in connection with the next great religion, and again at the establishment of the sixth root race. Be that as it may, the great man whom in his last life we knew as Henry Steele Olcott will be ready to bear his part in all such activities, to lead us as he led us before, devoted as ever to the service of his Master. Faithful as ever through life and through death. A course of study in Theosophy. It is desirable that one who wishes to study Theosophy thoroughly should acquaint himself in the course of time with the whole of Theosophical literature. This is no light task. And the order in which the books are taken is of importance if a man wishes to get out of them the best that he can. But at the same time it must be remembered that no order can be prescribed which will be equally suitable for every one. There are those who can usefully absorb information only along devotional lines, and there are those who must have a scientific and non-emotional presentation of the truth. The best thing that I can do, therefore, is to prescribe such a plan of reading as I have found to be on the whole most generally useful, leaving room for considerable variation to suit individual idiosyncrasies. It seems to me of great importance to have a clear outline of the whole scheme thoroughly in the mind before endeavoring to fill in the details. No one can know how strong is the evidence for any one part of the theosophical teaching until he knows the whole of that teaching, and sees how each separate portion is confirmed and strengthened by the rest. And is indeed a necessary part of the scheme as a whole. My advice, therefore, is that the beginner should read first the elementary literature, not troubling himself unduly with details, but seeking rather to take in and assimilate the broad ideas contained in it, so as to see all that they imply and to realize them as facts in nature, thereby putting himself into what may be called the theosophical attitude, and learning to look at everything from the theosophical point of view. To this end the student may take an outline of Theosophy, the riddle of life, hints to young students of occultism, and various lectures by Mrs. Besant and myself which have been issued as propaganda pamphlets. When he feels himself fairly certain of these, I should recommend next Mrs. Besant's popular lectures on Theosophy and then her Ancient Wisdom, which will give him a clear idea of the system as a whole. Another book which might be useful to him at this stage is Some Glimpses of Occultism. He can then proceed to follow details along whichever line most commends itself to him. If he is interested chiefly in the ethical side, the best books are, At the Feet of the Master, Light on the Path, The Voice of the Silence, The Path of Discipleship, In the Outer Court, The Laws of the Higher Life, The Three Paths and Dharma, and the Bhagavad Gita. One who wishes to study the life after death will find what he wants in, The Other Side of Death, the astral plane, death and after, the devachanic plane. If he is approaching the matter from the scientific side, the following books will suit him: Esoteric Buddhism, Nature's Mysteries, Scientific Corroborations of Theosophy, Occult Chemistry, and the Physics of the Secret Doctrine. If he cares for the study of comparative religion he should read, Universal Textbook of Religion and Morals, for Great Religions, The Great Law, the Bhagavad Gita, Hints on the Study of the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads. The Wisdom of the Upanishads, an advanced textbook of Hindu religion and ethics, The Light of Asia, a Buddhist catechism, Buddhist popular lectures and the religious problem in India. If he thinks chiefly of the Christian presentation of these truths, the best books are Esoteric Christianity, The Christian Creed, Fragments of a Faith Forgotten and The Perfect Way. If one wishes to investigate the origin and early history of Christianity, in addition to the books on the subject already mentioned, Mr. Mead's works will specially appeal to him. Did Jesus Live BC 100? The Gospel and the Gospel, Orpheus and Plotinus. The student who is interested in applying Theosophy to the world of modern thought, and to political and social questions, may profitably turn to The Changing World, Some Problems of Life, Theosophy and Human Life. Occult Essays and Theosophy and the New Psychology. If, as is the case with most inquirers, his main interest centers round the wider knowledge and the grasp of life resulting from a study of occultism, he should read, in addition to many of the books mentioned above, A Study in Consciousness. An introduction to yoga, clairvoyance, dreams, invisible helpers, man visible and invisible, thought forms, the evolution of life and form, thought power, its control and culture, the other side of death and the 2 volumes of the inner life. It will be desirable that he should comprehend the subjects dealt with in the manuals on reincarnation, karma, and man and his bodies. Indeed, these should be taken at an early stage of his reading. The earnest student who intends to live theosophy, as well as merely to study it intellectually, should also have knowledge of the inner purpose of the Theosophical Society. He will gain this from Mrs. Besant's London lectures of 1907 in The Changing World, from the Inner Life, 2 volumes, as well as from the study of Colonel Alcott's old diary leaves, and Mr. Sinnett's Occult World and Incidents in the Life of Madame Blavatsky. I myself think that the greatest book of all, Madame Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine, should be left until all these others have been thoroughly assimilated. For the man who comes to it thus thoroughly prepared will gain from it far more than is otherwise possible. I know that many students prefer to take it at an earlier stage, but it seems to me more an encyclopedia or book or reference. For books which are now in preparation should be added to the above list as soon as they appear, a textbook of theosophy, which endeavors to state the theosophical teaching in the simplest possible form, and without technical terms. The Hidden Side of Things, which shows how knowledge of occultism changes our view with regard to all sorts of small practical matters in everyday life, man, whence, how, whither. Which gives a detailed account of the past evolution of man, and shows something of the future which lies before him. First Principles of Theosophy, which is to approach the whole subject from the scientific standpoint, and to present it from an entirely new point of view. The course I have indicated above means some years of hard reading for the ordinary man, but one who has achieved it and tries to put into practice what he has learnt will certainly be in a position to afford much help to his fellow men. END